Tonight we travel to the oldest living civilization on Earth, a place that has been continuously inhabited, continuously building and thinking and worshipping, for something like 5,000 years, and which has never, in all that time, entirely stopped. That is what makes India different from everywhere else we have been together. Egypt fell, and its gods were forgotten, and its writing fell silent for 2 millennia. Rome fell, and the West spent 10 centuries living in its ruins, wondering how anyone had built them. But India never had that kind of ending. Empires rose and shattered there, invaders came and were absorbed, languages shifted and faiths multiplied. And underneath it all, the thing kept running. People are still bathing in the same river their ancestors bathed in 40 centuries ago, still singing hymns that were composed before the Trojan War, still using ideas worked out by men sitting under trees 25 centuries ago. It is less a story of rise and fall than of something that simply would not stop. And it is, I think, the most undertold great story in all of history. Everyone knows about the pharaohs and the Caesars. Far fewer know that while Rome was still a village of shepherds, there were cities on the Indus with covered sewers and flush toilets and grid-planned streets, or that the numbers you did arithmetic with today were invented in India, or that a man there once conquered half a subcontinent, looked at what he had done, and was so horrified that he spent the rest of his life apologizing on stone. So settle in. We have all night and 5,000 years to drift through. And it begins, as these things always seem to, with water, but not a river this time. With a wind. Picture the shape of it first, from very high up in the dark. A great diamond of land hanging south off the belly of Asia, thrust out into a warm ocean. Along the whole northern edge, sealing it off from the rest of the world, runs the highest wall on Earth, the Himalaya, a rampart of ice and rock so vast that it does not merely divide two lands, it divides two climates, two worlds. Below that wall, a huge flat plain, watered by enormous rivers running down out of the mountains, the Indus in the west, the Ganges in the east, depositing silt across a floodplain so rich and so vast that it could feed populations no other place could dream of. And south of the plain, the land rises into a great dry plateau, and then runs down through forests and hills to tropical coasts on both sides, and a long green tail pointing at the equator. It is not a country. It is a subcontinent, big enough and varied enough that it contains deserts and rainforests and glaciers and swamps, and hundreds of languages, and every kind of terrain a planet can produce. The Persians, coming from the west, named the river Sindhu in the local tongue, and in their mouths it became Hindu, and the Greeks turned that into Indus, and from the river came the name of the whole land. India is named after a river by foreigners who never went past it. But the thing that truly rules this land is not the mountains or the rivers. It is the wind. Every year, the subcontinent bakes. Through the spring, the land heats up until the air above it is scorching and rising. And as it rises, it pulls in air from the ocean to the south, and that ocean air is soaked with water. And then, in early summer, the whole system tips, and the monsoon breaks over India. It arrives like a wall. In a matter of days, the rain sweeps up the subcontinent from the south, and everything changes. The dust turns to mud. The dead brown land goes green almost overnight. The rivers swell. The wells fill. For 3 or 4 months it rains and rains, and in that rain is the entire year's water and the entire year's food, and the survival of hundreds of millions of people. And if it fails, if the wind is late or weak or doesn't come, people starve. It is that simple, and it has been that simple for 50 centuries. Everything in Indian life bends around this. The calendar, the festivals, the gods, the farming, the whole rhythm of the year is a long, tense wait for a wind, followed by an explosion of water and green and relief. Indian poetry is drenched in the monsoon, the smell of the first rain on hot dust, the black clouds piling up in the south, the unbearable waiting, the joy when it finally comes. That is the engine of this whole story. Not a river that floods obediently every year like the Nile, but a wind that comes out of the ocean and might or might not save you. It made a civilization that is deeply, permanently aware that everything depends on forces far larger than any human being. And that is a thought which runs, like a thread, through everything India would go on to think about the universe. And it was on the banks of the Western River, in a land watered by that wind, that the story properly begins, with a civilization so old, so advanced, and so completely forgotten that when men finally found it, barely a century ago, nobody in the world had any idea it had ever existed. In the 1850s, British engineers were building a railway across the plains of what is now Pakistan, and they needed ballast, crushed stone to lay the track on. And they found, conveniently, an enormous mound of ancient bricks nearby. Millions of them, beautifully made, all the same size, just sitting there in the middle of nowhere. So they used them. They ground up an ancient city and laid 100 miles of railway line on top of it, and thought nothing of it at all, because everyone knew there was nothing that old out here. The bricks were assumed to be a few centuries old. Nobody looked twice. It took another 70 years before anyone realized what had been destroyed. In the 1920s, archaeologists began properly excavating two sites, one called Harappa, the one the railway had eaten, and another, further south, that the locals called Mohenjo-Daro, which means, in the local language, the mound of the dead. And what came out of the ground rewrote the entire history of the world. Because these were not villages. They were cities, huge, sophisticated, planned cities, and they were more than 4 millennia old. They were contemporaries of the pyramid builders, and nobody in the entire literate world, in any surviving record anywhere, had ever mentioned that they existed. An entire civilization, as old as Egypt, as old as Sumer, and larger than either of them, had been completely erased from human memory. Not conquered and remembered, not fallen and mourned, forgotten so utterly that for nearly 40 centuries, not one person on earth knew it had ever been there. And when they dug it up, the shock deepened, because these cities were not just old, they were good. In some ways, they were better than anything that would exist in that part of the world again for thousands of years. And better, frankly, than most cities anywhere would be until the modern era. Start with the streets. Mohenjo-Daro was laid out on a grid, straight main avenues running north to south and east to west, crossing at right angles, dividing the city into neat blocks, with smaller lanes threading between the houses. This is a planned city. Somebody sat down before it was built and designed it. Compare that to the tangled, organic mess of medieval European towns 3 millennia later, or to Rome, which was famously a chaotic warren. These people laid out a city on graph paper. Then the bricks, standardized, not roughly similar, standardized, made to a consistent ratio in the same proportions across hundreds of miles and dozens of settlements. Somebody had a standard, and everybody used it everywhere for centuries. And then the thing that genuinely stuns people, the plumbing. Nearly every house in Mohenjo-Daro had its own bathroom. Not a chamber pot, a proper bathing floor, sloped with drainage. Many had toilets that flushed waste into a drain in the wall, and those drains ran out of the house and connected to a covered municipal sewer system running under the streets, built of brick, with inspection covers so it could be cleaned and maintained. There were public wells everywhere, hundreds of them, so that no one had far to walk for water. Take a moment with that, because it is genuinely difficult to hold. 45 centuries ago, Ordinary people in this city had running water access, private bathrooms, indoor toilets, and a working sewer system under their streets. London would not have that until the 1860s. Most of the world would not have it until the 20th century. These people had it while the Great Pyramid was still under construction. And at the heart of Mohenjo-Daro, on a raised platform, they built something whose purpose we still argue about: the Great Bath, a large watertight tank sunk into the ground, lined with fitted brick sealed with natural tar, with steps leading down into the water at either end, surrounded by a colonnade and small rooms. It is the earliest known public water tank in the world. It was almost certainly for ritual bathing, for purification, which, if true, means that the Indian practice of ritual bathing in sacred water, still performed by millions of people every single day, may be 45 centuries old and may go back to this exact building. But here is where the Indus Valley stops being merely impressive and starts being genuinely strange. Because as archaeologists dug further, they kept noticing what wasn't there. There are no palaces. In Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in every other early civilization we know, the first thing you find is the big man's house, a palace, dominating the settlement, dripping with wealth. In the Indus cities, nothing like it. The houses vary in size, yes, but there is no single vast residence, no seat of a king. There are no royal tombs, no pyramids, no ziggurats, no great burial of a god-king surrounded by gold and murdered servants. The graves that have been found are modest and broadly similar to one another. There are no temples that we can confidently identify, no towering religious complex at the center of the city. And most striking of all, there is almost no weaponry and almost no depiction of war, no mass graves of battle dead, no triumphant carvings of a ruler crushing his enemies. And remember that in Egypt and Mesopotamia, that image, the king smiting his foes, is absolutely everywhere. It is the central political image of the ancient world. In the Indus civilization, it simply does not appear. There is no art of conquest. There is no art of kings at all. So who ran it? Somebody clearly did. You do not get standardized bricks across a territory larger than Western Europe, and grid-planned cities, and municipal sewers, and uniform weights and measures, without organization on a serious scale. There was a system. There was authority. There was a shared standard that people hundreds of miles apart adhered to for centuries. But we cannot find the ruler, and there are honest scholars who now argue seriously that perhaps there wasn't one in the way we expect, that this may have been a civilization organized around merchants and councils and shared custom rather than around a king with an army, a thing so unlike every other early civilization that we barely have a model for it. Others think the rulers are simply invisible to us because their power took a form that left no monuments. Nobody knows. It is one of the great open questions in archaeology. And the reason nobody knows is the deepest frustration of all. They wrote. We have their writing. Thousands of examples of it, mostly on small carved seals, beautiful little squares of soapstone with an animal on them and a short line of symbols above. And we cannot read a single word of it. The Indus script has resisted every attempt at decipherment for 100 years. It has defeated generations of brilliant people, and the reason is brutal and structural. When scholars cracked Egyptian hieroglyphs, they had the Rosetta Stone, the same text in a known language beside the unknown one. When they cracked the Persian cuneiform, they had similar keys. For the Indus script, there is no bilingual text. Nothing. And worse, the inscriptions are agonizingly short, typically 5 signs, rarely more than about 20. There is no long passage to find patterns in. There is no known descendant language we can be certain it relates to. And we do not even know, for sure what language it was recording. Some scholars have even argued it may not be true writing at all, but a system of symbols, clan marks, trade tokens, religious signs that never encoded speech. Most disagree, but that is how bad it is. We cannot even agree on whether it is writing. So an entire civilization of millions of people, spread over 1 million square kilometers, with cities and plumbing and trade routes running all the way to Mesopotamia, is completely mute. We have their bones and their bricks and their toys and their jewelry and their drains. We have their words sitting right there in front of us, thousands of them, and we have no idea what any of them say. We do not know what they called themselves, what they called their gods, what their kings were named, if they had kings. We do not know a single Indus word. They are the only major ancient civilization that has never spoken to us. And then, around 3,900 years ago, it came apart. Not in a battle. For a long time, people assumed invaders had smashed it. That was the old story, a sudden, violent end. But the evidence never really supported it, and the modern picture is quieter and sadder and much more familiar. The climate turned. Evidence increasingly suggests that the monsoon weakened over centuries, that the rains grew unreliable and then thin, that the summer flooding the farmers depended on faltered, and there is strong evidence that a major river system that once watered the eastern half of the civilization dried up or shifted its course entirely, as rivers on a flat floodplain do, leaving cities stranded on dead channels. So the people did the only sensible thing. They left. Slowly, over generations, they drifted east and south, toward the Ganges plain, where the water still came. The great cities emptied, not sacked, just abandoned, the drains silting up, the streets going quiet, the bricks slowly disappearing under the dust. Urban life in that region simply stopped and did not return for 10 centuries. The people didn't die. They dispersed and became something else, and their descendants are still there. But the civilization ended. The script was never used again. The standardized weights vanished. Whatever they believed, and whatever they called themselves went with them. And it is worth pausing here, in the quiet, on the shape of that. The most advanced civilization on Earth, with plumbing that would not be equaled for 4 millennia, faded out because the rain changed. No enemy, no catastrophe, just a slow shift in a wind over generations, and a great and sophisticated world quietly packing up and walking away, and being so completely forgotten that when engineers found the bricks 40 centuries later, they crushed them for a railway. What came after the Indus cities is a strange inversion. The Indus civilization left us cities and drains and seals, everything except words. What followed left us almost the opposite, very little in the ground and an ocean of words. Because sometime in the second millennium before our era, in the northwest of the subcontinent, people began composing hymns in an early form of Sanskrit, and those hymns were never written down for something like 10 centuries. They were memorized, passed from teacher to student, mouth to ear, generation after generation, with a fanatical precision that is one of the most extraordinary feats in human history. These are the Vedas, and the oldest of them, the Rig Veda, is among the oldest surviving literature on Earth, over 1,000 hymns, composed roughly 35 centuries ago to be sung to the gods, and the priests who carried them developed memorization techniques of almost unbelievable rigor. They learned the text forwards, then they learned it backwards, then they learned it in alternating pairs, and in interlocking patterns that scrambled the word order in fixed mathematical schemes, so that if any single syllable slipped, the error would fail to fit the pattern and be caught instantly. It was error-correcting code, built out of human memory 3 millennia before computers. And it worked. Scholars comparing the recitations from lineages separated by 1,000 miles and many centuries, found them essentially identical. A text was carried across 100 generations, by voice alone, with a fidelity that written manuscripts routinely fail to match. When people say the oral tradition is unreliable, the Vedas are the counterexample that ends the argument. And here we arrive at one of the most contested questions in the study of the ancient world. So let me be straight with you about what is known and what is argued. The language of the Vedas, Sanskrit, is unmistakably related to Greek, Latin, Persian, and most of the languages of Europe. This is not a vague resemblance. It was one of the great discoveries of modern scholarship, made when a British judge in Calcutta in the 1780s noticed that Sanskrit structure was too close to Greek and Latin to be an accident. The word for father in Sanskrit is pitta, in Latin, pater. Mother is mater and mater. Three is treas and tres. There are hundreds of these, running through the core vocabulary and, more tellingly, through the grammar. It is now accepted beyond serious dispute that they all descend from a single ancestral tongue, spoken somewhere thousands of years ago, which scholars call Proto-Indo-European, which means that at some point, speakers of that language family arrived in northwest India. The mainstream scholarly view, supported by linguistics and increasingly by genetics, is that groups speaking early Indo-Aryan moved into the subcontinent from Central Asia, in waves, over centuries, in the second millennium before our era, some centuries after the Indus cities had already begun to decline. Not a conquering horde smashing the Indus. That older story has largely been abandoned, but pastoralists moving in over generations, mingling with the far larger existing population, and their language and religion gradually becoming dominant in the north. That reconstruction is disputed by some, particularly in India, where the question is entangled with modern politics and national identity in ways that make it far more heated than a debate about ancient migration should be. I will simply tell you where the weight of evidence currently sits and leave it there, because we are not here tonight to argue. What is certain and what matters for our story is this. The Vedic hymns exist. They are astonishingly old, and out of them grew nearly everything India would become. And the world those hymns describe is not the world of the Indus cities at all. It is a world of cattle and chariots and open country. These were herders and warriors, obsessed with cows. Cattle were wealth. Cattle were the measure of a man, and a great many of the hymns are frankly about wanting more cattle and defeating the people who have them. Their gods were forces of nature and of battle. The greatest of them was Indra, a roaring, thunderbolt-hurling, chariot-riding, gigantically drunk warrior god who slays a great serpent that has coiled around the mountains and hoarded all the waters of the world, and by killing it releases the rivers and the rain and sets the world flowing. Read that story again with the monsoon in mind, and you can see exactly what it is about. The terrible waiting, the black clouds, the thunder, and then the water crashing down and the world turning green. There was Agni, the fire, and fire mattered enormously because the whole religion turned on sacrifice, on offerings burned in a fire so that the smoke could carry them up to the gods. Agni was the mouth of the gods and the priest of the gods, present in every household hearth and every sacrificial altar. There was Varuna, who watched over cosmic order and truth and punished lies. There was Surya, the sun, Vayu, the wind, Ushers, the dawn, addressed in some of the loveliest verses in the collection. And there was Soma, both a god and a drink, pressed from some plant we can no longer identify, which the priests drank during the rites, and which seems to have produced ecstasy and visions. Whole books of hymns are addressed to it. Nobody today knows for certain what plant it was. Like the Indus script, it is simply gone. This was the religion of a mobile, cattle-raising, sacrificing people, and at first it had nothing to say about renunciation or meditation or escaping the world. It wanted rain, cattle, sons, and victory, and it believed that the correct sacrifice, performed with the correct words, would deliver them. It was a technology for getting things from the universe. And then, quite suddenly, in a way nobody fully understands, that changed. And the people of this land began asking a question that nobody in the ancient world had ever really asked before. Around the middle of the first millennium before our era, something happened in northern India that has few parallels anywhere in human history. A civilization that had been entirely occupied with sacrifice and cattle and rain suddenly turned inward and started asking the deepest questions human beings have ever asked, and produced answers so strange and so powerful that they still shape the inner lives of well over 1 billion people. The old religion was a transaction. Perform the rite, get the result. But somewhere in the forests and clearings of the Ganges plain, small groups of people, some of them priests, some of them nobles, at least a few of them women, began to feel that this was not enough. They started to withdraw from ordinary life, sit down and think. And what they asked was not, how do I get more cattle? It was, what is actually going on here? What is this world? What am I? What happens when I die? Why do we suffer? The texts they produced are called the Upanishads, and they are unlike anything else in the ancient world. They are not scripture, in the sense of laws, handed down from a god. They are records of conversations, arguments, dialogues, teachers and students going back and forth, a king questioning a sage, a boy pestering his father, a woman named Gargi cornering the greatest philosopher of the age in public debate with questions so relentless that he finally tells her that if she asks one more, her head will fall off. They are inquiry, not commandment. And the ideas they arrived at are the foundations of Indian thought, and they are worth drifting through slowly, because almost everything that follows in this story grows from them. The first was that this life is not the only one. They came to believe in rebirth, samsara, that a being dies and is born again, and dies and is born again, in a vast wheel turning through countless lives. Not once, not a single span with a judgment at the end, but again and again, endlessly, for time out of mind. The second was that the wheel is not random. What determines your next life is karma, literally, action. Every deed carries a consequence that ripens, in this life or a later one. Not a god's punishment, a law as impersonal and reliable as gravity. You are not being judged. You are simply experiencing the results of what you have done. It is one of the most morally serious ideas anyone has ever had, and it has an obvious dark side that Indian thinkers themselves wrestled with. It can be used to tell a suffering person that their suffering is their own fault, earned in a life they cannot remember. The third was the most radical. If life after life after life is what's on offer, they concluded that this was not good news. That was the great turn. The wheel is not a gift, it is a trap, an endless repetition of birth and loss and death and birth forever. And so the goal of existence is not to get a better next life. It is to get off the wheel entirely, to wake up, to see through the whole illusion, and to be released. They called that release moksha, liberation. And the fourth was the strangest and most beautiful. They asked what a person actually is, underneath, beneath the body, the name, the memories, the personality. And they concluded there was something there, a bare awareness they called the Atman, the self. And then they asked what the universe actually is underneath all its forms, and called that Brahman. And then they said the thing that is perhaps the single most audacious sentence in the history of religion. Those two are the same thing. The self at the bottom of you and the ground of the entire universe are not two things. They are identical. You are not a separate spark that came from somewhere and will go somewhere. You are right now, the whole thing, temporarily convinced that you are a person. In the most famous formulation, a father tells his son to dissolve salt in water, and then to find it, and of course he cannot, but the water is salt through and through, wherever he tastes it. And the father says, that subtle essence that is everything, that is truth, and that is what you are. Tat tivam asi. You are that. That is the deep bedrock of Indian religious thought. Not a god demanding worship, a puzzle, and a way out. The universe is a single thing. You are that thing you have forgotten. You are trapped in an endless recycling because of that forgetting. And the whole project of a human life is to remember, and to wake up, and to stop. You do not have to believe any of it to see how extraordinary it was. This was happening at roughly the same time that Greeks were beginning to do philosophy, and a Chinese thinker named Confucius was working out how a society should behave. One of those strange periods when, across the whole of Eurasia, human beings suddenly started thinking in new ways at once, for reasons nobody has satisfactorily explained. But the Indian version went in a direction the others didn't. It turned entirely inward. It treated the mind itself as the instrument and the object of investigation, and it developed practices, sitting still, watching the breath, watching the thoughts, to conduct that investigation from the inside. What the world would eventually call yoga and meditation began here, not as exercise or stress relief, but as a serious technology for prying open the nature of reality. And out of this ferment, this world of forest thinkers and wandering questioners and people walking away from their villages to sit under trees and find out what they were, there came, 25 centuries ago, a young man from a small kingdom in the north who left a palace and a wife and a newborn son in the middle of the night to go and find out why everything hurts. His name was Siddhartha Gautama, and he was born the son of a chief or minor king of a small people in the foothills of the Himalaya about 2,500 years ago. The traditional story says that his father, warned by a prophecy that the boy would become either a great emperor or a great holy man, decided he would have an emperor, and so he built his son a cage made of pleasure. Siddhartha was raised inside palace walls in perfect luxury, surrounded by beauty and music and every delight, and everything painful was kept out. He never saw sickness. He never saw old age. He never saw a corpse. He grew up married, had a son, and lived a life of untouched comfort inside the walls, and his father made certain that nothing in the world outside ever reached him. And then, the story goes, he went out and saw four things. He saw an old man, bent and shaking and ruined by years, and asked his charioteer what had happened to him, and was told, nothing has happened to him. This is simply what happens. It will happen to you. He saw a sick man, wrecked with fever, and asked, and was told, sickness comes to anyone. It could come to you. He saw a corpse being carried to be burned and asked, and was told, that is death. It comes for everyone. It is coming for you, and for everyone you love. And having seen those three things, the young prince understood, in a single afternoon, what his father had spent his whole life hiding. That the beautiful world he lived in was made of things that decay, that everyone he loved would sicken and age and die, that he would too, and that no amount of wealth or pleasure or power could prevent one moment of it. Everything he had was already, in a sense, gone. And then he saw the fourth thing, a wandering holy man, one of the countless seekers walking the roads of India in that ferment of forest thinkers, owning nothing and utterly calm. That night, Siddhartha got up, looked at his sleeping wife and his newborn son, and walked out of the palace and into the dark, and didn't come back. He was 29, and what followed was 6 years of the hardest possible searching. He went first to the great meditation teachers of the age, and he was good. He mastered everything they had, reached the highest states they could describe, and found that when he came out of those states, the problem was still exactly where he had left it. So he left. Then he tried the other road, the one the extreme ascetics walked: destroy the body and free the spirit. And he did it further than anyone. He starved himself down to almost nothing. The tradition says he ate a single grain of rice a day, that his spine could be felt through his stomach, that when he touched his belly, he found his backbone. He nearly killed himself. And at the very edge of death, he understood that this was not working either. A dying body was not a free mind. It was just a dying body, too weak to think. So he did something that must have looked, to his fellow ascetics, like total failure. He accepted a bowl of milk rice from a village girl and ate it. His 5 companions, disgusted at his weakness, abandoned him. And Siddhartha, alone, with food in him for the first time in years, sat down under a tree and decided he would not get up until he had solved it. The tradition says he sat through the night, and that everything came at him. The Lord of Desire and Death himself, the Tempter, sent armies and terrors and beautiful daughters and every distraction and threat that exists. And Siddhartha simply sat and did not move and did not react and reached down and touched the earth to witness his right to be there, and the whole assault dissolved. And in the watches of that night, watching his own mind, he saw it. Through the first part of the night, he saw all his own past lives, one after another, stretching back beyond counting. Through the middle of the night, he saw the whole wheel, beings dying and being reborn, everywhere according to their deeds, an endless churning ocean of lives. And in the last part of the night, before dawn, he saw the thing itself, why it turns and how to stop it. And when the morning star rose he was, the tradition says, awake. And from then on, he was not called Siddhartha, but the one who woke up, the Buddha. And what he had seen, he laid out with the plainness of a physician making a diagnosis. 4 statements. The first, life contains suffering. Not that everything is misery. That is a mistranslation people get stuck on. The word means something more like unsatisfactoriness, a fundamental unease, the way a wheel wobbles slightly on a bad axle. Birth, sickness, aging, death, being separated from what you love, being stuck with what you don't, and most subtly and most importantly, getting exactly what you wanted and finding that it does not hold, that it changes, that it does not fill the hole. Everything is running out, all the time, including you. The second, this has a cause, and the cause is craving. Not desire in the sense of wanting lunch, but the deep, endless thirst for pleasure, for existence, for things to be other than they are, for the moment not to end. The grasping at what is by its nature ungraspable, because everything is in motion and nothing stays. The third, and this is the one that makes it a religion of hope rather than despair, is that because it has a cause, it can end. Let go of the thirst, and the suffering built on it stops. There is a way out. That is the entire promise. And the fourth is the path. 8 practices covering how to see, how to intend, how to speak, how to act, how to earn a living, how to apply effort, how to pay attention, and how to concentrate the mind. Not belief, practice. He was very clear about that. He was not offering a god to worship or a doctrine to accept on faith. He explicitly told people not to believe him because he said it, or because it was in a tradition, or because a teacher taught it, but to test it themselves, as one would test gold, and accept it only if it held up. And he called it a middle way, because he had personally tried both extremes, the palace of pleasure and the starvation of the ascetics, and found that both of them failed, and that the road ran between. Then he did something that a lot of the mystics of his age did not do. He got up and walked back, and spent the next 45 years explaining it to anyone who would listen. He walked the roads of northern India, the Ganges plain, from town to town, year after year, decade after decade, teaching kings and merchants and farmers and thieves and prostitutes and outcasts, and his own family. He founded an order of monks, And then, after some resistance, he was talked out of an order of nuns as well. He accepted people from any caste, which was quietly revolutionary. He argued with Brahmins, refused to answer metaphysical questions he considered useless distractions, and repeatedly told people to stop making a fuss about him personally. And he died at about 80, of what sounds very much like food poisoning, in a small town, having eaten a meal offered by a blacksmith. And his last recorded concern was that nobody should blame the poor man who fed him. His final instruction to his weeping followers was not to look for a successor, or a leader, or a god. It was, everything falls apart. Work out your own salvation with diligence. He was, so far as we can tell, an ordinary human being who sat down and paid attention until he understood something, and then spent his whole life patiently explaining it, and told everyone that they could do it too. 25 centuries later, something like 500 million people follow what he worked out under that tree in one night. The Buddha was not alone. He was one of many teachers in that extraordinary century, and at least one of the others founded a faith that is still practiced today, and it went further than Buddhism in one particular direction, further, perhaps, than any religion has ever gone. His name was Mahavira. He was roughly the Buddha's contemporary and also a prince who walked away from everything, and the tradition he shaped is called Jainism, and its central commitment is non-violence, ahimsa, pursued with an absolutism that is genuinely staggering. The Jain view is that every living thing has a soul, and that harming any of them binds you to the wheel. So a devout Jain is strictly vegetarian, and beyond that will not eat root vegetables, because pulling up a root kills the whole plant and the small creatures living around it. Jain monks sweep the ground ahead of themselves with a soft brush, so as not to crush an insect underfoot. They strain their drinking water. Some wear a cloth over the mouth, so as not to inhale a small living thing. The most rigorous of them give up clothing entirely, owning nothing at all, because ownership itself is a form of grasping. It is an ethic so demanding that hardly anyone can live it fully, and yet it has been lived by somebody continuously for 25 centuries, and it did not stay in India. When a lawyer named Gandhi grew up in a part of India steeped in Jain influence and later built a political movement around non-violent resistance, and when that movement in turn inspired a Baptist minister in Alabama, the line runs back through the 20th century, through the Indian independence struggle, all the way to a prince in the Ganges plain 25 centuries ago who decided that harming things was the root of the problem. The world all this thinking was happening in was changing fast. The Ganges plain had filled up. Iron tools had let people clear the thick forests. The rich soil produced enormous surpluses, and cities had come back to India after their 1,000-year absence. Real cities again, with walls and markets and coinage and trade. And with cities came states. The plain organized itself into 16 great kingdoms and republics, jostling and warring and swallowing each other. Some were monarchies. Some, and this is little known, were something closer to republics, run by assemblies of clan elders who debated and voted, and one of them was the small state the Buddha himself was born into. The republics lost. Over a couple of centuries, the monarchies ate them, and one monarchy ate the rest. Magadha, on the eastern Ganges. It had the best position, iron mines, elephants, rich farmland, a river for a moat, and a run of exceptionally ruthless kings, including one who murdered his own father to take the throne, and then built an empire with a catapult and a chariot fitted with swinging blades. By the time we reach the 4th century before our era, Magadha ruled most of the north, under a dynasty called the Nandas, and it had something no Indian state had possessed before. A standing army of terrifying size, with tens of thousands of infantry, thousands of cavalry, and the thing that mattered, thousands of war elephants. And it was at exactly this moment that a young Macedonian arrived at the edge of India, at the head of the most successful army in the world. We have followed him before, on another night, all the way across Persia and out to the ends of the earth. This is where he stopped. Alexander crossed into the Indus Valley and found the small kingdoms of the northwest, and he beat them, including, at a river crossing in a thunderstorm, a king named Porus who fought him with 200 war elephants and lost, and who, when he was brought before Alexander wounded and asked how he expected to be treated, said, "As a king would treat a king." Alexander, delighted, gave him his kingdom back and more. But then Alexander's army heard what was waiting further east, across the next rivers. The Nanda Empire, with an army several times the size of anything they had faced, and thousands of elephants. And after 8 years of marching, having conquered the entire Persian world, his veterans looked at that, and finally, quietly said no. They refused to go on. There was no mutiny, no violence. They simply stood in the rain and would not move. Alexander raged and sulked in his tent for days, and then turned around and never saw India properly at all. He went back west and died in Babylon. So India stopped Alexander, not with a battle, but with a rumor. And the interesting part is what he left behind. Not conquest, a few garrisons that evaporated within a couple of decades. What he left was contact. The routes were open now. Greek kingdoms would sit on India's northwest frontier for centuries, and Greek and Indian ideas and art and coins and astronomy would flow back and forth through them, and some remarkable things would grow in that overlap. And one more thing. There is a story, impossible to verify, and told with different details in different sources, that a young Indian man met Alexander during those campaigns and studied that army and saw exactly how a professional force could smash the kingdoms of India and went away and thought about it. Within about 2 years of Alexander's death, that young man had overthrown the Nandas, taken Magadha, and founded the largest empire the subcontinent had ever seen. His name was Chandragupta Maurya, and where he came from is genuinely unknown. The traditions disagree wildly, some making him a lost prince, others insisting he was low-born, possibly the son of a peacock tamer. What is agreed is that he was nobody, and that he ended up ruling nearly everything. And he did it with a partner, an older man, a Brahmin scholar of ferocious intelligence and colder ferocity, remembered as Chanakya. The story says Chanakya had been humiliated at the Nanda court, insulted, thrown out, publicly shamed, and that he untied the knot of hair on his head and swore in front of everyone that he would not bind it again until the Nanda dynasty was destroyed root and branch. Then he went and found a talented young man and spent years building him into the instrument of that revenge. Together they did it. They raised armies on the frontier, learned from early defeats. There is a lovely story of Chandragupta overhearing a mother scolding her child for eating the hot center of a dish before the cooler edges, and realizing that this was exactly his mistake, striking at the enemy's heartland while leaving the borders intact behind him. And then they rolled the Nandas up from the edges inward and took Magadha. And then, when Alexander's general Seleucus came east to reclaim the Indian territories his dead king had taken, Chandragupta met him and beat him, and the peace terms tell you everything about how the power balance had shifted. Seleucus gave up all the eastern provinces, plus a marriage alliance, and got 500 war elephants in exchange. Those elephants went west, and won Seleucus a decisive battle in Asia Minor a few years later. India's elephants shaped the wars of the Greek world. Chandragupta ended up ruling from Afghanistan to Bengal, most of the subcontinent, unified for the first time in history. And the reason we know so much about how that empire worked is that Chanakya, or someone in his tradition, wrote it all down in a manual of statecraft called the Arthashastra. and it is one of the most startling books to survive from the ancient world. It is a handbook for running a state, and it is utterly without sentiment. It covers taxation, agriculture, mining, the treasury, law, the management of guilds. It also covers, in careful detail, how to run a secret service, because the Mauryan state ran on spies, and the book explains how to recruit them, how to disguise them as ascetics and merchants and prostitutes, how to plant them in the households of your own ministers, how to test the loyalty of your officials by having agents tempt them with treason and see who bites. It covers assassination. It covers poison. It covers how to use disinformation to destabilize a neighbor, how to manufacture a pretext for war, how to plant agents in an enemy court and turn his advisors against him. People compare it to Machiavelli, and that undersells it. It is far more systematic, far more detailed, and about 18 centuries earlier. It is the single most clear-eyed and least sentimental account of how power actually works that survives from antiquity. It even discusses, calmly, the circumstances in which a king should be deposed. And around this machine, the Mauryan state was built. A vast bureaucracy, a road running from the northwest frontier to the Ganges Delta with rest houses and wells and shade trees, a census, a standing army of hundreds of thousands, and a capital city that a Greek ambassador who lived there described with astonishment. Miles of wooden walls with hundreds of towers and dozens of gates, ringed by a moat, one of the largest cities on earth. And then the founder of the largest empire in Indian history did something that tells you a great deal about this civilization. The tradition holds that Chandragupta, at the height of his power, having conquered nearly everything there was to conquer, became a Jain, and that when a great famine came, he abdicated, simply gave the empire to his son, walked away from it, went south with a Jain teacher, and spent the rest of his life as a naked, wandering ascetic, owning nothing. And that at the end, on a hill in the south, he did the thing the most rigorous Jains still occasionally do. He sat down and calmly and voluntarily stopped eating and starved himself to death deliberately over weeks as a final act of releasing every attachment, including to his own body. There is a cave on that hill they still show you, and it is called by his name. The most powerful man in the world walked away from all of it and sat down on a rock to die of nothing, and his grandson, who would inherit this whole terrifying machine of spies and elephants and roads, would go on to make an even stranger decision and become, in the opinion of many people who have looked at the whole sweep of the ancient world, the most remarkable ruler who has ever lived. His name was Ashoka, and he came to the throne of the Mauryan Empire around 268 years before our era, and the early traditions about him are not kind. They say he took the throne in a bloodbath, killing rival brothers to get it. They say he was cruel, one legend, probably invented later to sharpen the contrast, claims he built an elaborate torture chamber disguised as a beautiful palace and called it his hell. They called him Ashoka the Fierce. Whatever the truth of the stories, he was, at minimum, a hard and effective ruler of the most powerful state in the world, with the Arthashastra's spy network and hundreds of thousands of soldiers at his command. And 8 years into his reign, he went to war with a kingdom on the east coast called Kalinga, the last significant patch of the subcontinent his family had not conquered. It was a prosperous, proud, independent state, and it did not want to be part of his empire. So he took it. And he won. Completely. And the scale of what that cost is recorded in a place nobody expected. In Ashoka's own words, carved into rock by his own order. Because this is the extraordinary part. Every conqueror in the ancient world put up monuments after a victory. Every single one, the pharaohs smiting their enemies, the Assyrians boasting of flayed skins, Rameses covering Egypt with his triumph at Kadesh. That is what the inscription is for. You win, and you carve how great you are. Ashoka carved something else. He put up an inscription that says that in the conquest of Kalinga, 150,000 people were deported, 100,000 were killed, and many times that number died afterward. And then it says, and I want you to sit with the fact that an emperor at the height of his power ordered this cut into stone for everyone to read, that he felt profound sorrow and regret for what he had done, that the slaughter, the death, the carrying away of captives was deeply painful to him and weighed on his mind, that when an independent country is conquered, the killing and dying and deportation fall on Brahmins and holy men and ordinary decent householders who never had anything to do with it, on people who loved and were loved, whose families are torn apart, whose friends and relations suffer even when they themselves survive. He says that even those who escaped death suffer through the misfortunes of the people they love. And then he says that he considers the true conquest to be conquest by right conduct rather than by weapons, and that he wishes his sons and grandsons to make no new conquests at all. There is nothing else like it in the ancient world. Nothing close. This is the most powerful man on earth who has just won, publishing an official state document declaring that the victory made him sick, apologizing to the people he massacred, and instructing his descendants to stop. The traditions say he walked the field at Kalinga after the battle, among the bodies and the burning, and something in him gave way. Whether that particular scene happened or not, the inscription is real. It is still there. You can go and read it. And he did not simply feel bad. He rebuilt his entire life and his entire empire around the feeling. He became a Buddhist, the faith of that teacher from the north, then still one movement among many, and he made non-violence and compassion the operating principle of the largest state in the world. And then he tried to actually implement it, at scale, with the machinery of a police state built by Chanakya. He gave up wars of conquest, permanently. An emperor with the strongest army on earth simply stopped using it to take things, which is close to unheard of in human history. He gave up the royal hunt, the great sport of kings everywhere, and replaced his pleasure tours with pilgrimage tours to holy sites. He drastically cut the killing of animals in the royal kitchens and recorded the reduction publicly, from many hundreds of animals a day down to 2 peacocks and a deer. And he adds that in future, even those 3 will not be killed. He banned certain animal sacrifices and restricted hunting and the killing of many species outright. One edict lists the protected creatures, and it includes parrots, geese, bats, queen ants, tortoises, porcupines, squirrels, rhinoceroses, and touchingly, all 4-footed animals that are neither useful nor edible. He planted shade trees along the roads and dug wells at intervals for travelers and animals. He built rest houses, and he founded what may be the first state-supported hospitals in history. And remarkably, he says he established medical treatment for both humans and animals, and had healing herbs imported and planted wherever they were lacking. He sent envoys, missionaries, really, out along the trade routes, south to Sri Lanka, where his own son and daughter carried Buddhism and where it took permanent root, and west to the Greek kings of Egypt, Syria, Macedon, and beyond, whom he names in his inscriptions by name, which is how we can date his reign precisely. And he built, according to tradition, on a staggering scale, stupas, monasteries, and the great polished sandstone pillars, 40 feet high and cut from single blocks of stone, hauled hundreds of miles and raised across his empire, so highly polished that early archaeologists could not believe they were ancient. But the thing he really left is the words. Ashoka's edicts are carved on rocks and cliffs and pillars all across the subcontinent, dozens of them, from Afghanistan to the south, in the local languages of each region so ordinary people could actually read them, and in Greek and Aramaic on the northwest frontier so that the foreigners there could read them too. And they do not read, like royal proclamations. They read like a person talking. He calls the people his children. He says he wants them to be happy in this world and the next. He tells his officials that they must not imprison or torture people arbitrarily, that they must be impartial, and that he is sending inspectors around every few years specifically to check that they are behaving. He asks people to be kind to servants and slaves, to respect their parents, to be generous, to be truthful, to be restrained in speech. And most striking of all, he asks for religious tolerance in the 3rd century before our era. He says that all sects deserve respect. He says that a person who praises his own faith and disparages the faith of others out of devotion does harm to his own faith. He says people should learn the doctrines of others. He says the growth of the essential in all religions is what matters. And he says that concord is best, that everyone should listen to one another's teachings and be willing to hear them. He also quietly admits things. He tells us he was not always like this. He says that in the past there was no proper business of state or reporting of it at all hours, and he has changed that. He confesses the remorse over Kalinga in public and permanent stone. There is a humility running through these inscriptions that no other ancient ruler on earth ever committed to rock. And then he was forgotten completely. The Mauryan Empire collapsed about 50 years after his death, and Ashoka became a half-remembered legend in some Buddhist stories. And the pillars stood around India for 20 centuries, with nobody able to read the script on them at all. It was only in the 1830s that a British scholar cracked the ancient script, and the pillars finally spoke. And the world discovered that this voice, this astonishing, remorseful, gentle voice, had been standing in the open, in plain sight, saying these things to nobody for 2 millennia. When India became independent in 1947, it chose its national emblem, the 4 lions from the top of one of Ashoka's pillars. And on the national flag, it put the wheel from that same pillar, the wheel of Dharma, the wheel the Buddha set turning. 23 centuries later, a modern nation looked back across its entire history for something to stand for, and picked the conqueror who was sorry. Ashoka built, and the thing he built most of was the stupa. A stupa is not a temple. You cannot go inside one. There is no inside. It is a solid dome of brick and earth, and buried at its heart is a relic, a fragment of bone or ash, and the entire enormous mass of it is a container for that fragment. You do not enter. You walk around it, clockwise, keeping it on your right, and the walking is the worship. The tradition says that after the Buddha was cremated, his remains were divided among 8 claimants, and that Ashoka later gathered them up, divided them again into a legendary 84,000 portions, and built a stupa over everyone across his empire. The number is a pious exaggeration. The impulse was real, and the greatest of them still stands at Sanchai, on a hill in central India. Ashoka founded it. Later dynasties enlarged it and cased it in stone and wrapped it in a railing, and in the 1st century before our era added 4 gateways, and it is those gateways that make Sanchai one of the essential places in world art. They are stone, about 35 feet high, and they are carved so densely and so beautifully that it takes hours to see one. Elephants, horses, riders, spirits of trees, scenes from the Buddha's past lives, crowds of villagers, monkeys offering honey, a whole world in miniature. The carving is unmistakably by people whose hands knew wood and ivory. The stone is worked with a fineness that stone does not naturally want to give. And there is one detail at Sanchai that stops people when they notice it. The Buddha is not there. In all those crowded panels, telling story after story from his life, he is never shown. Where he should be, there is a gap, an empty seat under the tree, a pair of footprints, a parasol with nobody beneath it, a wheel, a riderless horse walking away from a palace gate with an attendant holding a parasol over an empty saddle. The crowds kneel and gesture and adore, and the space they are adoring is blank. For roughly 500 years, nobody made an image of the Buddha. Whether it was a prohibition, or reverence, or simply the sense that a man who had extinguished himself could not sensibly be drawn, is argued about. But the effect is extraordinary. Sanchai's gateways are full of a man-shaped absence, and the absence is more present than any statue would be. He is depicted by not being depicted. It may be the most sophisticated thing anyone has ever done with an empty space. A civilization that would shortly give the world the number 0, spending 5 centuries carving pictures of nothing and making it the center of the composition. And then, around the 1st century of our era, on the northwest frontier, in the region called Gandhara, where the Greek kingdoms Alexander left behind had been sitting for centuries, and where Central Asian dynasties now ruled and trade poured through, somebody made a face. Nobody knows exactly who, or exactly why the prohibition broke. But suddenly the Buddha has a body, and it is a Greek body. The Gandhara Buddhas stand in the contrapposto of a Greek statue. They wear a Roman toga's worth of naturalistic drapery, carved with the deep folds and the wet cloth realism of Mediterranean sculpture. Their faces are Apollos, straight nose, curved lips, wavy hair pulled into a topknot. Attendant figures are drawn from Greek myth. There are Corinthian columns and garlands and centaurs and tritons wandering through Buddhist scenes. It is one of the strangest and most beautiful collisions in the history of art. An Indian religion given a human face by sculptors working in a Greek tradition, thousands of miles from Greece, 3 centuries after the last Greek king in the region had died. Alexander conquered nothing that lasted here, but the artistic vocabulary his settlers left behind sat on the frontier for 300 years. And then, at the exact moment Buddhism needed a face, was there to lend it one. And that face traveled. Every Buddha image in the world, in Thailand, in China, in Japan, the enormous ones carved into cliffs, the small brass ones on shelves in Western apartments, descends from that moment on the northwest frontier, when Indian devotion borrowed a Greek nose. The half-closed eyes and the topknot and the folded robe went east along the Silk Road and around half the planet. And they are still the standard picture of a man who sat under a tree in Bihar and whom, for 500 years, nobody dared to draw at all. Beneath the empires, ordinary life in ancient India went on with a rhythm that would be recognizable for the next 20 centuries, and it is worth drifting through for a while. Most people were farmers, and the year turned on the monsoon exactly as it does now. The long, dry wait, the breaking of the rains, the planting, the growing, the harvest. They grew rice in the wet east and wheat and barley in the drier northwest, along with lentils, sesame, sugarcane, a plant India gave the world, along with the process for crystallizing its juice into something you could carry, which is where our word sugar ultimately comes from. They grew cotton, and had been growing and weaving it since the Indus cities, thousands of years before anyone else, and Indian cotton would eventually clothe much of the planet. The villages ran themselves largely through councils of elders and paid a share of the harvest to whoever the king happened to be that decade, and the kings came and went above them like weather while the village stayed. That is one of the deep structural facts of Indian history. Empires rose and burst, but the village underneath simply kept going and often barely noticed. The cities were something else. Walled, crowded, laid out on streets, with quarters for different trades. The potters here, the ivory carvers there, the weavers over there, and guilds that were serious institutions, running their own affairs, setting standards, acting as banks. There were markets full of goods from across the world, gambling halls, taverns, and courtesans who were not simply prostitutes, but figures of real cultural standing in some cities, trained in music and poetry and conversation, wealthy enough to endow monasteries. Houses were built around courtyards. Families were extended, grandparents, uncles, cousins, all in one compound. Food was eaten with the right hand from leaf plates, the spices that the entire rest of the world would eventually go insane over, pepper above all, plus cardamom, ginger, turmeric, were simply what dinner tasted like. And running through all of it was a system that was, at this point, still soft, and would over the following centuries harden into something far more rigid: caste. It seems to have begun as a broad division of function: priests, warriors and rulers, farmers and merchants, and laborers and servants. A scheme first described in a late Vedic hymn. In the early period, it appears to have been relatively fluid. The texts contain people who move between categories, and the Buddha's order accepted anyone from any background, which suggests the walls were not yet high. But over time, it calcified. It fused with thousands of local birth groups and occupational communities, and it became hereditary and rigid. Your birth fixed your work, your marriage, your food, your neighbors, and your status permanently with no exit. And below and outside the whole scheme were people considered so polluting that they could not be touched, whose shadow falling on a higher caste person could require a purification ritual, who were forced to live outside the villages and do the work no one else would do. It is one of the most durable systems of stratification human beings have ever built, and it lasted in force for something close to 20 centuries, and its effects have not gone away. India outlawed untouchability in its constitution in 1950. That is well within living memory. So we should hold this the way we held Rome's slavery, and for the same reason. Ancient India produced philosophy of extraordinary depth, mathematics that changed the world, an emperor who apologized for a war, and a religion built on universal compassion, and simultaneously built and maintained a hierarchy that condemned millions of people to hereditary degradation for 100 generations. Both are true. Civilizations are not good or bad. They are large. And these cities were not isolated. India sat at the center of the ancient world's trade, and everything moved through it. To the west, Indian ships and Arab intermediaries ran goods to Egypt and the Roman Empire, and after Greek sailors worked out how to use the monsoon winds to cross the open ocean instead of hugging the coast, that trade exploded. Roman ships came directly to India's southwest coast in fleets, and what they came for above all was pepper, which Romans were so addicted to that Pliny, the elder, complained bitterly that the empire was hemorrhaging silver to India every year for a substance with no nutritional value whatsoever, that merely tasted good. He wasn't wrong. Roman coins have been dug up in southern India in enormous hoards. There was a Roman trading settlement on the east coast, and when the Goths sacked Rome, part of the ransom the city paid was pepper, thousands of pounds of it, because Indian pepper was, at that point, a store of value. And to the east, Indian traders and monks and priests went out into Southeast Asia and did something remarkable. They exported a civilization without ever conquering anybody. Indian scripts, Indian religion, Indian epics, Indian architecture spread across what is now Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, Indonesia, not at spear point, but carried by merchants and holy men, adopted enthusiastically by local rulers who liked what they saw. The vast temple at Angkor Wat is a Hindu temple. The Ramayana is performed in Java and Bali. Thai kings took the name of Rama. India's deepest imperial reach was accomplished entirely by trade and persuasion, and its results outlasted every empire in this story. You cannot tell this story without stopping for the elephants, because no other civilization has ever had a relationship with an animal quite like this one. Egypt had the cat. Rome had the horse. India had a 5-ton wild animal with a mind of its own and built a civilization around it. They were never truly domesticated. That is the first thing to understand. You cannot breed elephants in captivity at any useful rate. The pregnancy runs nearly 2 years, and the animal takes a decade and a half to grow up. So every working elephant in Indian history was a wild animal, captured, and then persuaded, which means the entire relationship was individual. One elephant, one keeper, usually for life, often from the keeper's boyhood to the elephant's old age. And the elephant knew its man and would take orders from him and frequently from no one else. In war they were the heavy armor of the ancient world. A war elephant with a fighting platform on its back and archers in it, plated in metal, with blades on its tusks, was terrifying in a way that is genuinely hard to reconstruct. Horses that had never smelled one would simply refuse to advance, and infantry lines broke before contact. It was the elephants, remember, that stopped Alexander, not by fighting him, but by existing in numbers, several rivers away, in a rumor. And they were unreliable, in exactly the way a wild animal is. A frightened elephant turns around and goes through its own army, and Indian handlers carried a spike and mallet for precisely that circumstance, to kill their own animal before it killed their own men. Every serious military text in India discusses this calmly. They were also the world's first heavy machinery. They hauled timber, moved stone, cleared forest, and did work that nothing else could do until the internal combustion engine. Chandragupta gave Seleucus 500 of them and got the whole northwest of the subcontinent in exchange. And those elephants went west and won a battle in Asia Minor that decided the shape of the Greek world. And then, on top of all that, they became sacred. The most popular god in India has an elephant's head. Kings kept them as the ultimate expression of wealth. They carried the images of gods through the streets at festivals, painted and dressed in gold, and they still do. There are treatises on them, whole technical manuals on capturing, feeding, training, and treating elephants, including detailed veterinary sections on their diseases. Ashoka's edict establishing medical care for animals was, in part, about these. A civilization that produced formal logic, and the number 0 also produced a serious literature on elephant medicine, because the elephants mattered that much. They were the tanks, the cranes, the limousines, and the gods, all at once. And every single one of them was a wild animal that had agreed, more or less, to come along. Of everything ancient India gave the world, and it gave a great deal. One thing sits above all the rest, and you used it today without thinking about it once. You wrote a number. Here is the thing that is genuinely hard to grasp. For most of human history, arithmetic was miserable. Try it with Roman numerals. Multiply mdcclxiv by Roman 37. You cannot, really, not on paper, not by any method a normal person could learn. Romans did serious arithmetic on a counting board with pebbles, and their written numerals were essentially a way of recording a result someone else had computed with their hands. The system had no way to express place. It had no concept for an empty column. Nothing in Rome's magnificent engineering was calculated in Roman numerals, because you cannot calculate in Roman numerals. What Indian mathematicians worked out over centuries, culminating around 1500 years ago, was the system that fixed all of it at once, and it had 3 pieces. First, a small set of symbols, one for each digit, the ancestors of the shapes 1 through 9 that you are picturing right now. Second, place value, the idea that the position of a digit determines its size, so that the same symbol means one thing here and 10 times that thing one step left. Others had groped toward this. The Babylonians had a version of it in base 60. And third, the piece nobody else ever quite got, 0. a symbol for nothing, treated as a number in its own right, that could sit in a column and hold the place. Not a gap, not a mark meaning this column is empty, a number, something you could add, subtract, multiply by, and put in an equation. That third step is the one that took thousands of years, and it is a genuinely strange conceptual leap. To look at nothing and give it a name and put it in a row with the real numbers and treat it as one of them. Many cultures resisted the idea, and there is a decent argument that a civilization steeped in philosophies that thought seriously about emptiness, about the void, about absence as a real category, had an easier time making the jump. And in the 7th century, an Indian mathematician named Gupta did something no one had ever done. He wrote down the rules. What happens when you add 0 to a number? What happens when you subtract it? He defined negative numbers as debts, which is exactly right, and gave the rules for those too. A debt minus nothing is a debt. A fortune minus nothing is a fortune. He is the first person we know of to treat 0 as a number and work out its arithmetic. He even tried to divide by it and got it wrong, which is forgivable because everyone got that wrong for another 10 centuries. And then this system did what good ideas do. It traveled. It went west along the trade routes into the Islamic world, where a Persian scholar in Baghdad wrote a book explaining the Indian method of calculation. And the Arab world adopted it immediately, because it was obviously, overwhelmingly better than what they had. From there it crossed into Europe, where an Italian merchant's son who had grown up in North Africa learned it, understood exactly what he was looking at, and wrote a book in the year 1202 introducing it to Europe. His name is remembered now for a sequence of numbers he mentioned almost in passing, but that was not his contribution. His contribution was this. Europe resisted for centuries. Some cities banned the new numerals outright. They were foreign, they were suspicious. A 0 could be altered into a 9 by a dishonest clerk. Merchants used them in secret because they were so much faster. It took roughly 300 years for Europe to fully give in. And we still call them Arabic numerals, because that is where Europe got them from, which is a bit like crediting the postman with the letter. The Arabs themselves called them Hindu numerals and knew exactly where they came from. Take a second with what this actually means. Every calculation done anywhere on Earth today runs on this system. Every price, every measurement, every equation, every line of code, every bank balance, every rocket trajectory, the entire quantitative apparatus of the modern world sits on a foundation worked out by mathematicians in ancient India, and the single most important component of it is a symbol for nothing at all. And that was not the half of it. An astronomer named Aryabhata, writing at the age of 23 around 1500 years ago, calculated the value of pi to 4 decimal places, and remarkably described it as approximate, which suggests he grasped that it could not be pinned down exactly. 10 centuries before that was proved. He stated that the Earth rotates on its axis, and explained that the apparent movement of the stars westward is caused by the Earth turning eastward, using the image of a man in a boat who sees the shore moving backward. He said the moon and planets shine by reflected sunlight, not their own. He gave the correct explanation of eclipses as shadows, in an age where the standard account involved a demon swallowing the sun. And he calculated the length of the sidereal year to within a couple of minutes of the modern value. Indian mathematicians developed the sine function, which is the basis of trigonometry, and their tables traveled west with the numerals. Later Indian scholars in the south worked out infinite series for pi and for sine and cosine, the tools at the heart of calculus, some 300 years before Newton and Leibniz. And it seems they may have understood the underlying idea of taking a limit, which is calculus's beating heart. They thought about very large numbers, with an enthusiasm that borders on the comic. Where the Greeks tended to treat the infinite as a problem to be avoided, Indian mathematicians and philosophers ran toward it. Jain texts developed elaborate classifications of different sizes of infinity, and Buddhist and Hindu cosmologies casually deal in timescales of billions of years, cycles of creation and destruction on a scale that no other ancient culture came close to imagining, and which happens, by pure accident, to be in the right ballpark for the actual age of the universe. They did all of this while writing in verse, incidentally. Aryabhata's astronomy is composed in metered Sanskrit because it had to be memorized. The most sophisticated mathematics on Earth was being carried in people's heads as poetry. Somewhere around the 5th century before our era, in a city on the Ganges, there lived a surgeon named Sushruta, and the textbook that carries his name describes things that should not have been possible. It lists over 100 surgical instruments: scalpels, forceps, needles, probes, saws, hooks, and it explains how students should practice with them before ever touching a person. Cutting on gourds and cucumbers to learn incisions, on rotten wood to learn scraping, on dead animals to learn dissection, on wax spread over a board to learn suturing, on lotus stalks in water for extraction, on leather bags full of water to learn draining. It is a graded surgical curriculum, 25 centuries ago, complete with practice models. It describes cataract surgery, the specific procedure of entering the eye with a curved needle and displacing the clouded lens out of the line of sight, then packing the eye with warm butter and bandaging it. It describes removing bladder stones. It describes setting fractures, draining abscesses, delivering babies in difficult positions, extracting arrows and stitching intestines. Using, for some of that, an ingenious trick. Large black ants were held to the edges of a wound and allowed to bite, clamping it shut, whereupon the bodies were twisted off and the heads left in place as sutures. And most famously, it describes reconstructive surgery of the nose, because in a society where a common judicial and personal punishment was cutting off the nose, there were a lot of people who needed one. The method Sushruta lays out is to measure a leaf to the size of the missing part, cut a matching flap of skin from the cheek or forehead, leave it attached at one end so the blood supply is preserved, rotate it down over the wound, shape it, prop the nostrils open with tubes, and dress it. That technique, a pedicle flap, kept alive by its own attached blood supply, is the founding operation of plastic surgery, and it works, and it is still fundamentally what reconstructive surgeons do. It reached Europe in the 1790s, when a British surgeon watched an Indian craftsman perform a nose reconstruction and published an account of it. European surgeons copied the method. It is called the Indian flap. It is still called that. That surgery sat inside a whole medical system, Ayurveda, the knowledge of long life, which is one of the oldest organized medical traditions in the world, and which is, honestly, a mixed bag that deserves an honest description. The good parts are very good. It insisted on careful clinical observation and detailed case taking. It classified hundreds of diseases and thousands of medicinal plants, and a fair number of those plants really do contain active compounds we now use. It grasped that diet, sleep, exercise, and mental state affect physical health, which Europe would take an embarrassingly long time to take seriously. It noticed that a sweet urine disease appeared in the wealthy and the sedentary and prescribed exercise and diet. A recognizably sound approach to diabetes, many centuries before the West got there. It practiced a form of inoculation against smallpox, deliberately exposing people to material from a mild case to protect them, long before Jenner. Its surgical tradition, as we have seen, was unmatched anywhere on Earth. The theory underneath, though, was wrong. A system of 3 humors that had to be kept in balance, which is no more correct than the 4 humors that dominated European medicine for 20 centuries. and a good deal of the practice that flowed from that theory did nothing. So, a tradition with genuine, hard-won, empirical medical knowledge, embedded in an explanatory framework that was mistaken, which describes essentially all pre-modern medicine everywhere, and is worth saying plainly, because Ayurveda is sold today with a great deal of nonsense attached to it, and the real history is more interesting than the marketing. What is not in dispute is the surgery. In a world where European doctors would still be bleeding patients with leeches 20 centuries later, there were men in India cutting cataracts out of eyes and building people new noses out of their own foreheads and writing down exactly how they did it so that others could learn. The Mauryan Empire fell about 50 years after Ashoka, and India did what India does. It broke into pieces and got on with things. For 500 years, the north was a patchwork: Greek kingdoms, on the frontier, Central Asian dynasties, local powers. And this was not a dark age at all. It was a period of enormous trade, of the great Buddhist art of Gandhara, where Greek sculpture met Indian religion and produced, for the first time, the image of the Buddha as a human figure in flowing Greek drapery. Roman gold poured in. The South flourished under its own kingdoms, with their own literature in Tamil, a language and a poetic tradition that has been running continuously ever since, and is one of the oldest living literatures on earth. And then, around 1600 years ago, a dynasty from the eastern Ganges pulled the north back together, and India entered what is traditionally called its Golden Age, the Gupta Empire. It was smaller than the Mauryan and looser. It ruled directly at the center and let subordinate kings run their own affairs at the edges, and it was far less of a police state. Chanakya's machine of spies and terror was not rebuilt. What the Guptas presided over instead was a long period of prosperity, stability, and an explosion of creative and intellectual work, so concentrated that it defines the period. Aryabhata worked in this age. The zero and the decimal system were being finalized in this age. The medical and surgical texts were compiled in the form we have them in this age. The great Sanskrit grammar tradition, which had already produced, centuries earlier, a description of the Sanskrit language so rigorous and so complete that modern linguists regard it as one of the greatest intellectual monuments of the ancient world, and which anticipated ideas that would not resurface until the 20th century and the invention of formal computer languages was fully mature. And the literature. This was the age of Kalidasa, the greatest poet and playwright in the Sanskrit language, whose plays and lyric poems have the kind of standing in India that Shakespeare has in English. His most famous work is a play about a king who falls in love with a girl in a forest hermitage, and then, under a curse, forgets her entirely. And when Europe finally read it in translation in the 1790s, Goethe was so overwhelmed that he wrote a little poem about it, and it helped set off the whole European fascination with India that followed. And the art of this age survives, in a place that was, like the Indus cities, completely forgotten and then found by accident. In 1819, a British hunting party chasing a tiger through a remote gorge in western India spotted something odd in the cliff face across the ravine. It turned out to be a horseshoe-shaped canyon with about 30 caves cut into the rock, Buddhist monasteries and prayer halls, carved directly into the cliff, some of them going back 20 centuries, abandoned around 13 centuries ago and swallowed by jungle so completely that nobody knew they were there. And inside, on the walls in the dark, were the paintings. They are among the greatest achievements of world art, and almost nobody outside India has heard of them. Enormous murals covering the walls and ceilings of the caves, painted in rich mineral colors, scenes from the Buddha's past lives, court scenes, processions, gods, animals, dancers, lovers, the whole crowded life of the age. And the figures are not stiff or formal. They lean and bend and turn. Their eyes are heavy-lidded and tender. There is a famous figure of a compassionate being, holding a lotus, head tilted slightly, gazing down with an expression of such gentle, sorrowful sweetness that people stand in front of it in silence. They were painted in almost total darkness. The caves go deep into the rock, and the artists worked by whatever light could be reflected in from outside. And they covered every surface, hundreds of feet of it, with work of that quality. And then the monasteries were abandoned, and the jungle grew over the entrance, and it all sat there in the dark for 1,200 years. And nearby, at another site, later builders did something even more physically absurd. They carved an entire temple, a full-sized Hindu temple complex, with a courtyard, a gateway, columns, shrines, life-sized elephants, multiple stories, and a tower over 100 feet high, out of one single piece of rock. Not built, excavated. They started at the top of a basalt hill and cut downward and inward, removing something like 200,000 tons of stone, and what was left standing when they finished was a temple. There was no room for error. You cannot put a piece back. It took, by most estimates, a couple of centuries, and it remains one of the most staggering things human beings have ever done with rock. And in the East, in this same age, there was a place called Nalanda. It was a Buddhist monastic university, and it was, by any reasonable definition, one of the first universities in the world, founded around 1,500 years ago, running for 700 years, at its height home to something like 10,000 students and a couple of thousand teachers. You could not simply enroll. There were gatekeepers who examined you at the door with hard questions, and the traditions say that most applicants were turned away. If you got in, you studied inside a walled campus of monasteries and temples and lecture halls and lakes and gardens, with a library said to have occupied several multi-story buildings and to have held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. And what they taught was not only Buddhism. It was logic, grammar, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, including the philosophies of rival schools, taught seriously, because you cannot argue against a position you do not understand. Students came from China, Korea, Japan, Tibet, Persia, and across Southeast Asia, and Chinese pilgrims who studied there left detailed, admiring accounts of the place, of the debates, the discipline, the hundreds of lectures a day, the fact that even foreign scholars were supported at the state's expense. It was destroyed around 800 years ago in an invasion. The tradition holds that the great library burned for months. But for 7 centuries it stood there, on the plain in Bihar, examining people at the gate, a place where you could travel from China and be admitted to argue about logic and be housed and fed while you did it. Oxford and Cambridge and Bologna and Paris are all younger, considerably younger. The Buddha refused to answer metaphysical questions. He compared a man who demanded to know whether the universe was eternal before he would accept treatment to a man shot with a poisoned arrow who refuses to have it pulled out until he knows the name of the archer and the caste of his family and the wood of the shaft. Pull out the arrow, he said. Everything else is a distraction. His followers did not take the hint. Within a few centuries, they had built enormous philosophical systems, and around 1,800 years ago, one of them produced a thinker who is, by fairly wide agreement, one of the most formidable minds in the history of philosophy anywhere. His name was Nagarjuna, and what he did was to take the tools of Indian logic and turn them on everything, including his own side, and demolish it. His central idea is called emptiness, and it is almost universally misunderstood as nihilism, which it is not. What he argued is this: nothing has an independent, self-standing essence. Take anything, a chariot, a person, a moment, a cause, motion, time itself, and look for the thing in itself that makes it what it is, and you will not find it. A chariot is not its wheels, or its axle, or the sum of its parts, or something separate from them. It exists entirely in dependence on other things and on being conceived of. Pull the relations away, and there is no chariot essence sitting underneath. And that goes for everything. Everything is empty of inherent existence, which does not mean nothing exists. It means things exist the way a reflection exists, really there, and not standing on their own. His method was ferocious. He rarely asserted anything. Instead, he would take a position, any position, including the Buddhist ones, and drive it into contradiction. He did it to causation, showing that a thing cannot arise from itself, or from something else, or from both, or from neither. So the very notion of arising falls apart under scrutiny. He did it to motion. In an argument about the moving mover that would be at home in a modern logic seminar. He did it to time. He did it to the self. He did it most audaciously to the Buddha's own Four Noble Truths, and to nirvana, and to emptiness itself. Because if emptiness were a thing with an essence, it would refute his whole point. He said that anyone who takes emptiness as a view is incurable. And then he turned the knife the last time, and argued that nirvana and ordinary existence are not two different places. There is no elsewhere to escape to. The wheel and the release from the wheel have the same boundary. What changes is not where you are, it is whether you are grasping. That philosophy is the foundation of most of the Buddhism practiced in Asia today. It went to China and became the basis of the schools there. It went to Tibet, where monks still spend 20 years studying it, and where the debate courtyards, with their stamping and clapping and formal challenge and response, are the direct continuation of the argument culture we walked through earlier, exported over the Himalaya and preserved after India let it go. And it is worth sitting with the shape of it, because it rhymes with everything else in this story. This is a civilization that gave the world zero, a symbol for nothing, treated as a real thing you can calculate with. It carved a Buddha-shaped hole at Sanchai and made the absence the object of worship. And it produced a philosopher who argued that if you look for the essence at the bottom of anything at all, you will find that there is nothing there, and that this is not a catastrophe but a liberation, because it means nothing is fixed, and therefore everything can change. Different domains, no direct causal line between them, and probably a coincidence. But there is something in this civilization that was unusually comfortable with nothing, that could look at emptiness without flinching, and find it useful and build on it. Everyone else's mathematics stalled for millennia at the empty column. India put a number in it. We have talked about philosophy and empires and mathematics, but if you want to know what actually lives in the heart of this civilization, what ordinary people knew by heart, what grandmothers told children, what has been performed and painted and argued over for 2,000 years, it is two poems. The first is the Mahabharata, and it is the longest poem in the world. Not the longest ancient poem. The longest, full stop. It runs to something like 100,000 verses, roughly 10 times the combined length of the Iliad and the Odyssey. It grew over centuries, absorbing everything, until it became less a poem than a container for an entire civilization's thought. And it says of itself, with total accuracy and considerable cheek, that whatever is here about right conduct and wealth and pleasure and liberation may be found elsewhere, but what is not here is nowhere. The story at its core is simple and terrible. Two branches of one royal family, cousins, fall out over the throne, and it ends in a war that destroys them all. But nothing in it is simple. The good side gambles away its kingdom, its freedom, and its shared wife in a rigged dice game, and then has to watch her be dragged into the hall by her hair and humiliated in front of everyone, while every great man present sits silent because the rules technically permit it. The bad side contains men of real honor who are trapped by old promises into fighting for a cause they know is wrong. The greatest warrior on the enemy side turns out to be the hero's own unknown eldest brother, abandoned at birth, who has spent his whole life being humiliated for his low birth, and who refuses at the end to switch sides, because the wrong people were the only ones who ever showed him kindness. The war is won by a series of tricks and lies and outright dishonor, and the victory is so hollow it barely counts as one. Nearly everyone dies. The old king ends up walking into a forest fire. It is the least triumphant epic ever written. And in the middle of it, at the moment the armies are drawn up and about to start killing each other, everything stops for one of the most famous conversations in world literature. The great archer of the good side, looking across the field at the men he is about to fight, sees his cousins, his teachers, the old man who raised him, everyone he loves, arrayed against him, and simply breaks. He drops his bow. He tells his charioteer he cannot do it, that no kingdom on earth is worth this, that he would rather be killed unarmed than kill these men. And his charioteer, who happens to be a god walking around in human form, answers him. And the answer is 18 chapters long, and it is called the Bhagavad Gita, the Song of the Lord, and it is the single most important religious text in India. What it says, roughly, is this: you are grieving for people you need not grieve for, because the thing that is really you was never born and will never die. Bodies wear out like clothes and are changed. You have a duty, and the duty is yours specifically. It is better to do your own duty badly than someone else's perfectly. And here is the key. Act, but let go of the fruit. Do what is right because it is right, and surrender your claim on the outcome. Not indifference, engagement without grasping. Do the work, release the result. That is the whole yoga of action, and it is a way of being in the world without being enslaved by it. And then, when the warrior asks to see who he is really talking to, the god shows him, and it is one of the most terrifying passages in world religion, a vision of a being of infinite mouths and eyes and arms filling the entire universe, all the worlds pouring into its burning mouths like moths into a flame, the future already inside it, everyone on that battlefield already dead. And the god says, I am time, the destroyer of worlds, and these men are slain already. Be the instrument. Those words came back into history in a way nobody could have predicted. When the first atomic bomb was detonated in the New Mexico desert, the physicist who had led the project, who had learned Sanskrit specifically to read this poem, said the line that came to him as the fireball rose was that one. The second epic is the Ramayana, and it is shorter, cleaner, and more beloved. A prince named Rama, the ideal man, is exiled from his kingdom on the eve of his coronation through a piece of court scheming, and goes into the forest for 14 years with his wife Sita and his devoted brother. And in the forest, a demon king carries Sita off to his island fortress, and Rama, with the help of an army of monkeys and an extraordinary monkey general named Hanuman, who can leap across the sea, who grows to enormous size, who is the model of pure devotion, and who is, today, one of the most beloved gods in India, crosses to the island, fights an enormous war, kills the demon king, and gets her back. And then it does the thing that has caused 2 millennia of argument. Rama, the perfect man, cannot simply be glad. He questions whether Sita remained pure while she was in another man's house. She walks into a fire to prove it, and the fire god himself hands her back unburnt. And even that is not the end. Later, hearing his subjects still gossiping, he sends his pregnant wife into exile in the forest anyway, for the sake of the kingdom's opinion of its queen. That ending has never sat right with anybody, and Indians have been arguing about it for millennia, retelling it, rewriting it, telling it from Sita's point of view, telling it from the demon king's point of view. There are hundreds of Ramayanas. In some southern and Southeast Asian versions, the demon king is a tragic hero. The epic is not a fixed scripture. It is a living argument that a civilization keeps having with itself. And it went everywhere. It is performed in Indonesia, in Thailand, in Cambodia, in Bali, in Muslim-majority countries, cheerfully, as heritage. Thai kings named themselves after Rama. The story has been told in every Indian language, in shadow puppets and dance and paintings. And when it was made into a television series in India in the 1980s, the streets emptied. Hundreds of millions of people stopped whatever they were doing every Sunday morning to watch it, and there are photographs of people garlanding their television sets. That is what these two poems are. Not literature that people study. Stories that a fifth of humanity grew up inside. Somewhere in all of this, the old Vedic religion of sacrifice and thunder gods quietly became something else. The thing the world now calls Hinduism, though nobody in India called it that until foreigners needed a word for it. It has no founder, no single scripture, no central authority, no council that decides what is true. It is less a religion in the Western sense than an enormous, sprawling family of traditions that grew together over 3 millennia and never bothered to agree. And the old gods faded. Indra the Thunderer, who dominates the Rigveda, dwindled into a minor figure who mostly shows up in stories to be embarrassed. In their place rose gods who are still worshipped by 1 billion people today. There is Vishnu, the preserver, the god who maintains the world, and who, when things go badly wrong, comes down into it in a physical form to set them right. Those descents are the avatars, and they include the two great epic heroes. Rama is one, and the charioteer of the Gita is another. This is a god who keeps showing up in history, wearing a body when he is needed. There is Shiva, and Shiva is stranger and older and wilder. He is the destroyer, but that is a bad translation. He is transformation, the force that ends things so that new things can happen, which is not the same as evil. He sits in meditation on a mountain, covered in ash from cremation grounds, with a snake around his neck, and the crescent moon in his matted hair, and a river pouring out of it, an ascetic god of the wilderness who is also a passionate husband and a father. And he dances, the image of Shiva dancing inside a ring of fire, 1 foot raised, one hand holding the drum whose beat begins creation, one holding the flame that ends it, one raised to say do not be afraid, and one pointing to the lifted foot that is the way out, is one of the great religious images ever made. And it is the universe itself, being created and destroyed forever in a dance. And there is the goddess, Divi, who is not one figure but many, and who is not a consort or an assistant, but in her own traditions, the ultimate power itself. She is Parvati, the gentle wife who melts the ascetic's heart. She is Lakshmi, wealth and fortune. She is Saraswati, learning and music and speech, who sits with a book and a stringed instrument and is prayed to by every student in India before an exam. And she is Durga, riding a lion, armed by all the gods with all their weapons, who exists because a buffalo demon had a boon that no man or god could kill him, and who was made precisely because the gods, all of them together, could not do it and needed her. And she is Kali, black and terrible, garlanded with skulls, tongue out, dancing on the body of her own husband, who is death itself and is worshipped by people who love her as a mother. There is Ganesha, with the elephant's head, the remover of obstacles, the friendliest god in the pantheon, invoked at the start of any new venture, whose image sits in millions of shops and cars and homes. And there are, the tradition happily says, 330 million of them. Oh, one. Because the same tradition that fills the sky with gods also produced the Upanishads, and the philosophical answer that all of these are faces of a single reality that has no face, sits perfectly, comfortably alongside a farmer leaving flowers for a village goddess at a roadside shrine. Nobody finds this contradictory. That is perhaps the most characteristically Indian thing about it. And the way this religion is lived is not much like the Western picture of religion either. There is no Sabbath, no congregation, no sermon, no requirement to believe a list of statements. The core act is darshan, seeing, and being seen by the god. You go to the temple, you stand in front of the image, and you look at it, and it looks back at you. That is the transaction. You bring flowers or fruit or light a lamp, and the priest offers it and hands part of it back to you, now blessed, and you eat it. Most worship happens at home, at a small shrine in a corner, and most of it is done by women, daily, without ceremony. There are festivals, the festival of lights in autumn when every house is outlined in small lamps and the whole country glows. The festival of colors in spring when the rules briefly dissolve, and everybody throws powdered pigment at everybody else, and hierarchy stops mattering for a day. There are pilgrimages to rivers, and to mountains, and to temples. There is the Ganges, which is not a river with a goddess in it, but a goddess who happens to be flowing, and in which millions of people bathe to be washed of what they have done. And there is the largest gathering of human beings that occurs anywhere on earth, for any reason, a religious festival at a river confluence that draws tens of millions of people, so many that the crowd is visible from orbit. It has been happening in some form for well over 10 centuries. That is what happened to the sacrifices and the cattle hymns. They turned into this, a religion with no headquarters and no founder that has been continuously running for longer than any other, that never quite decided whether there is one God or 300 million, and that concluded, on the whole, that the question was less interesting than most people think. And there is one more thread running through all of this that is easy to miss, because it does not survive in stone. Indian classical music is one of the oldest continuously performed musical traditions on earth, and its roots are in the Vedic chant we started with. Because the Vedas were not spoken, they were sung in fixed pitches, and one of the four Vedas is essentially the melodies. The music began as a way of getting the words right, and what grew out of it is built on an idea unlike Western music. The organizing unit is the raga, and a raga is not a scale and not a key and not a tune. It is closer to a personality. It has a set of notes, yes, but also a characteristic way of moving through them. Notes you may only approach from above, notes you must linger on, ornaments that belong and ornaments that do not, phrases that identify it. It is a set of rules and a mood and a set of gestures, and within it the performer improvises at length, building the thing in front of you. And ragas are attached to times. Certain ragas belong to the early morning, before dawn, others to midday, to sunset, to late night, others to the monsoon. And there are old stories about a rain raga so powerful that singing it correctly would bring the clouds. A serious musician will not perform a morning raga in the evening. The music is fitted to the hour of the day it is meant to inhabit, which means that for 20 centuries there has been specific music intended for the deep part of the night, when it is dark and quiet and most people are asleep. The rhythm is its own world, cycles of beats, sometimes very long ones, with an emphasis structure inside them, and the drummer and the melodist chase each other around the cycle and land together on the first beat, and the whole audience feels it land. There is no conductor, no score, no written composition in the Western sense. It is carried the way the Vedas were carried, teacher to student, directly over years, by ear and by imitation, and by living in the teacher's house. The lineages are traceable back for centuries. When a musician sits down in Kolkata tonight to play a late-night raga, they are executing a system whose bones are in a book from the Roman era, and whose ultimate root is in men singing hymns on the Ganges plain 3 millennia ago, and it has never once stopped being performed. That is the pattern of this whole story, in one art. Not a ruin, not a reconstruction, a thing that started before Rome and is happening tonight. In Delhi, standing in a courtyard, there is an iron pillar about 24 feet tall and weighing 6 tons. It was made roughly 1600 years ago, in the Gupta age. And it has not rusted. 16 centuries, standing outdoors in the open air through 1600 monsoons, and the thing is essentially clean. There is a slight film on it. That is all. Iron left outside for 1600 years should be a pile of orange flakes. This is not a mystery in the sense of being unexplainable. Metallurgists worked out the answer decades ago, but the answer is arguably more impressive than a mystery would be. The iron has an unusually high phosphorus content, and it was made by a process that left that phosphorus in rather than removing it. And over time, the phosphorus reacted with the surface to form a dense, even self-repairing protective film a fraction of a millimeter thick, which seals the metal from the air. Ancient Indian smiths did not know any of that chemistry. They arrived at it by centuries of accumulated craft, by doing it this way because this way worked. And they produced, by hand, a 6-ton single mass of iron of a quality that European foundries could not have matched until the Industrial Revolution, and gave it a corrosion resistance that modern engineers study. That was not a one-off. India was, for centuries, the world's finest producer of steel. Smiths in the south developed a crucible process that produced a steel of remarkable purity and carbon content, and that steel was exported west in ingots, where it acquired a legendary reputation. The swords forged from it in the Middle East, with their distinctive watery, rippling surface pattern, were the famous Damascus blades that European crusaders came home telling stories about. The technique of making the raw material was Indian, and when the supply eventually broke down, the secret of those blades was lost for centuries and is still not fully reconstructed. And while we are here, in the quiet, let me hand you a short list of things that came out of this civilization, because most of them are so thoroughly woven into ordinary life that nobody thinks about where they came from. Chess. It began in India as a game called Chaturanga, 4 limbs, named for the 4 divisions of an Indian army: infantry, cavalry, elephants, and chariots. Those became the pawn, the knight, the bishop, and the rook. It went west to Persia, where the piece called the king was addressed as Shah. And when your king was trapped, you said Shah Mat, the king is helpless. Checkmate. You are speaking Persian and playing an Indian game every time you say it. Cotton. Spun and woven in the Indus cities 45 centuries ago, when Europe was in wool and Egypt in linen. Indian cotton became the world's most desired textile, and the trade in it eventually helped set off the Industrial Revolution, because British mills were built specifically to compete with Indian cloth. Sugar. The crystallization process is Indian, and the word runs from Sanskrit through Persian and Arabic and Latin into essentially every European language. Buttons, seemingly, in the Indus cities, rulers marked in precise units, and standardized weights in the same place. The first known dock built for tides, on the west coast, 40 centuries ago. 0, the decimal system, and the numerals, as we have seen, the foundation of all modern quantitative anything. Plastic surgery, as we have seen. Cataract surgery. Inoculation. The board game that became Snakes and Ladders, invented as a moral instruction about virtue and vice hauling you up and down through the rounds of rebirth. Yoga, obviously, though almost nothing about the modern gym version resembles what it originally was. Meditation, as a systematic technology, which is currently being handed back to India by Western neuroscience departments as a novel wellness intervention. And the sheer, staggering scale of Indian thinking about time. While European chronology was working with a universe a few millennia old, Indian cosmology was casually operating in cycles of 4.32 million years, grouped into larger cycles, grouped into a single day of the Creator God lasting over 4 billion years, followed by a night of equal length, repeating forever. 4.32 billion years. The actual age of the Earth is about 4.5 billion. They were not doing science. They were doing metaphysics with very large numbers because very large numbers pleased them. But no other ancient civilization on the planet was even in the right order of magnitude. Everyone else thought the world was a few thousand years old. India thought in billions and shrugged. There is one more place we should visit before the end, and it is the oldest city in this story that is still a city. Varanasi sits on the north bank of the Ganges, and it has a decent claim to being among the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth. The Buddha taught his first sermon in a deer park just outside it, 25 centuries ago, and it was already ancient then. Mark Twain visited and wrote that it looked older than history, older than tradition, older even than legend, and twice as old as all of them put together, which is a wild overstatement and also exactly right in spirit. The city faces the river, and the whole waterfront is a continuous flight of stone steps running for miles down into the water. They are called ghats, and from before dawn they are full of people, bathing, praying, washing clothes, doing yoga, selling flowers, cutting hair, sitting. The sun comes up across the river onto the face of the city, and thousands of people are standing waist-deep in the water with their hands raised. And this has been happening here every single morning for something like 30 centuries without a break. And people come here to die. That is the thing about Varanasi. The tradition holds that this city is sacred to Shiva, and that to die within it is to be released, to step off the wheel we have been talking about all night, to end the whole endless cycle of birth and death and birth permanently. So the old and the dying come. There are houses in the city that exist specifically to take in people who have come to Varanasi to die, and they wait there, sometimes for weeks, and their families wait with them. And on two of the ghats, the fires burn continuously. This is where the bodies are cremated, in the open, on the riverbank, in public, in the middle of the city, all day and all night. The wood is stacked in the lanes above. The families carry the body down through the streets on a bamboo stretcher, wrapped in cloth, and dip it in the river, and lay it on the pyre, and the eldest son lights it, and it burns while everybody else goes on with their mourning around it. The laundry, the tea, the kids playing cricket on the steps, the cows, the boats. One of those fires is said to have been burning without going out for millennia. And nobody hides any of it. That is what strikes visitors hardest, not the death, but the absolute ordinariness of it. The pyres are not behind a wall, in a facility on the edge of town. They are on the main waterfront, between the bathers and the boats, and the smoke goes up over the city all day, and people walk past. It is, in a way, the whole civilization compressed into one riverbank. Everything we have talked about tonight is there. The philosophy that says the self at your bottom is the ground of the universe, the wheel and the wish to get off it. The river that is a goddess, the god who dances in a ring of fire because destruction and creation are the same motion. All of it, not in a text, but in practice, on a Tuesday morning, while somebody sells you tea. They have been doing it since before Rome existed. They were doing it while the Buddha walked past on his way to the deer park. They are doing it right now tonight, while you are lying here in the dark. The fires are burning on the steps, and the river is going by, and the city is full of people who came a long way to stop. Everything we have followed so far has mostly happened in the north, the Indus, the Ganges, the great empires of the plain. But there is a whole other India, south of the plateau, with its own languages, its own literature, its own dynasties, and its own extraordinary story, and the North's empires mostly never got there. The southern languages are not related to Sanskrit at all. They are a completely separate family, Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, Malayalam, and Tamil in particular has a claim few languages on earth can make. It has been a literary language, continuously, for over 20 centuries, and its oldest surviving poetry is still readable and still read. That poetry is startlingly good and startlingly, unlike the North's. It is secular and personal and concrete. Poems about love and war, about a woman waiting for a man who has gone away across the desert, about a drummer whose family is starving, about the specific plants and birds of specific landscapes. No gods, no philosophy. Just people and weather and longing from 20 centuries back. The South was rich because it sat on the ocean. It had the pepper and the ports, and the Romans came to it. It traded east and west, and it built its own kingdoms. And in the 9th century, one of them became something remarkable. The Chola Empire on the southeastern coast did something no other Indian power ever seriously did. It built a navy and used it. Indian civilization spread across Southeast Asia, mostly by trade and persuasion, as we have seen. The Cholas were the exception. They conquered Sri Lanka. They raided and dominated the Maldives. And then, in the 11th century, they launched a full naval expedition across the Bay of Bengal, a fleet crossing more than 1,000 miles of open ocean to attack a maritime empire in what is now Indonesia and Malaysia, and they won, sacking its ports and breaking its control of the straits. An Indian fleet crossing the Indian Ocean to conquer Sumatra 900 years ago. Almost nobody outside the region has heard of it. And at home, they built one of the great buildings of the world. In their capital, they raised a temple to Shiva with a tower over 200 feet high, the tallest in India when it was built, made of granite in a region with no granite nearby. So every block was hauled from many miles away. At the very top sits a single capstone of enormous weight, and how they got it up there is still argued about. The tradition says they built a ramp several miles long and rolled it. It has stood for 10 centuries in an earthquake zone, and it is still a working temple. People are worshipping in it today. But the thing the Cholas made that is beyond argument is the bronzes. They cast statues of the gods using the lost wax method, sculpt the figure in wax, pack it in clay, melt the wax out, pour the bronze in, break the mold, which means every single one is unique, and there is exactly one chance to get it right. And what they produced is, by wide agreement, among the finest metal sculpture ever made anywhere. The greatest of them is Shiva as the lord of the dance. He stands inside a ring of flame, one leg lifted and crossed, the other planted on a small crouching figure of ignorance, arms out in perfect balance, hair flying out in strands, absolutely still and absolutely in motion at the same time. It is physically impossible and completely convincing. The weight is distributed so that the whole thing floats. Sculptors and physicists have both written about it. It is 10 centuries old. There is a bronze of Shiva's consort that is so beautiful, so alive in the curve of the hip and the tilt of the head, that when the sculptor Rodin saw a photograph of a Chola bronze, he wrote that it contained everything he had spent his life trying to achieve. And these were not made as art. They were made to be gods, dressed in silk, garlanded, bathed in milk, and carried out through the streets on festival days on the shoulders of the faithful, which is what they are still doing in the same towns today. Some of the most sublime sculpture on earth was made to be taken for a walk. Here is a marvel that almost nobody outside of linguistics has heard of, and which people who work on it will tell you, with total seriousness, is one of the greatest intellectual achievements of the human race. In the 4th century before our era, in the northwest of the subcontinent, a man named Panini sat down and described the Sanskrit language completely. Every sound, every word formation, every inflection, every rule for how pieces combine and change when they meet, the whole machine. He did it in about 4,000 rules. And the rules are not descriptions in prose. They are formal statements in a compressed technical notation he invented for the purpose, arranged in an order that matters, rules that feed into other rules, rules that block other rules, general rules that apply unless a more specific rule overrides them. He used meta-rules, rules about how to apply the rules. He used a system of markers and abbreviations so dense that a rule can be 3 syllables long and carry a paragraph of meaning. What he built in the 4th century before our era is a generative grammar. You start with a root and a set of features, apply the rules in order, and the correct Sanskrit word comes out the other end. It is an algorithm. It is a formal system with a defined input, ordered operations, and a determinate output. Linguists did not build anything comparable until the 20th century, and when they did, when formal grammars and generative linguistics and the theory of computer languages emerged in the 1950s and 60s, people who knew about Panini looked at the new work and recognized it. The technique of using a general rule with specific exceptions ordered to override it is standard in computer science now. The formal notation used to define the syntax of programming languages turns out to be essentially equivalent to something Panini was doing 2,400 years earlier, and some computer scientists have proposed calling it the Panini-Bacchus form for that reason. He was doing this without writing. It was composed to be memorized and recited. The notation is compressed the way it is precisely because it had to fit in a human head. A complete formal description of one of the most complicated languages on Earth, built as a memorizable algorithm by one man before Alexander was born. And the effect on India was enormous, because once Panini had fixed Sanskrit, it stopped drifting. It became a permanent, stable, precisely defined language, which is why texts composed 25 centuries apart are in the same language, and why Sanskrit could serve as the shared intellectual medium of a subcontinent with hundreds of mother tongues, in the way Latin did for Europe. The grammar froze it deliberately, and that is why the tradition has such extraordinary continuity. The tradition that grew around him produced commentaries, and commentaries on the commentaries, and a school of linguistic philosophy that spent centuries on questions like what a word actually refers to and how meaning attaches to sound. Questions the West would not take up with comparable rigor until quite recently. That is the thing about this civilization that is easy to miss. The marvels are not only the temples and the bronzes. Some of them are invisible and made of grammar. The visible marvels, though, are considerable. Indian temple architecture is built on an idea entirely unlike a church or a mosque. A cathedral is a space for a congregation. You go inside, and the interior is the point. An Indian temple is not primarily a room. It is a mountain. The god lives in a small, dark, plain chamber at the center, the womb chamber, and the enormous structure piled on top of it is the sacred mountain that houses the god, and the whole thing is meant to be walked around and looked at from outside. The inside is tiny and dark. The outside is where everything happens. And what happens on the outside is that every square inch is carved. At Khajuraho in central India, a dynasty raised a group of temples in the 10th century whose walls are covered, completely covered, with hundreds of sculpted figures, and they are astonishing. Gods, animals, musicians, dancers, warriors, and above all human beings, in every posture and mood, carved with a sensuous grace that is unlike anything in European religious art. Women dressing, writing letters, playing with children, looking in mirrors, taking a thorn out of a foot. There is nothing stiff about them. They are alive. And a fraction of those carvings, perhaps a tenth, are explicitly erotic, which is what the site is famous for, and which has caused a great deal of embarrassed nonsense to be written. Why they are there is honestly not settled. The most sensible view is probably the simplest. This was a civilization that produced a whole literary genre about erotic love and a famous treatise on it, and did not regard desire as shameful. It treated pleasure as one of the legitimate goals of a human life, listed openly alongside duty, prosperity, and liberation. So the outside of the temple shows the whole of life, all of it, everything a person can be and want, in enormous profusion. And then you leave all of it behind at the door and step into a small, dark, empty room to meet the god. The carvings are the world. The chamber is what is past the world. Read that way. The arrangement is not a contradiction at all. It is the whole argument of the civilization, in stone. In the south, they went a different way and built gateway towers, enormous pyramidal gates over the temple walls, rising 150 feet or more, absolutely encrusted with thousands of brightly painted sculpted figures, thousands per tower, a riot of gods and demons and animals in every color. Standing under one is genuinely overwhelming. There is too much to see. That is the point. Somewhere around the turn of the millennium, someone in India wrote a book about theatre. It is called the Natya Shastra. It runs to 36 chapters and thousands of verses, and it is the reason Indian classical dance, music, and drama still exist in the form they do. It covers everything: stage construction, costume, makeup, musical scales and rhythm, types of drama and how to plot them, and then in exhaustive detail, the body. The exact positions of the head, the eyeballs, the eyebrows, the eyelids, the neck, the hands, the feet. It catalogues dozens of distinct hand gestures with fixed meanings, so that a dancer's hands can literally speak. This one means a lotus, this one a deer, this one the flow of a river, this one the god Vishnu. There are separate catalogues for one-handed and two-handed gestures. There are specified movements for the eyeballs alone. And at the heart of it is a concept that is one of the most sophisticated pieces of aesthetic theory anyone has produced. Rasa. The word literally means juice, or sap, or flavor. And the idea is that a performance does not depict an emotion. It distills one so that the audience can taste it. The performer's job is to produce the flavor. The audience's job is to savor it. It is not identification, and not catharsis in the Greek sense. It is closer to tasting. The text lists the primary flavors: the erotic, the comic, the compassionate, the furious, the heroic, the terrifying, the disgusting, the wondrous. And later a ninth was added and argued over for centuries: peace. That framework has governed Indian performance for 2 millennia. When you watch a dancer in Chennai today, moving her eyes and hands through precise codified gestures to tell a story from the epics, she is executing a system laid out in a book written around the time of the Roman Empire, and it has been passed down, teacher to student, without a break, ever since. And while we are here, we should deal honestly with the one ancient Indian text that everyone in the West has heard of, because what it actually is bears almost no resemblance to its reputation. The Kama Sutra was written around 1800 years ago, and it is not a manual of positions. That is a small part of one of its 7 books. What it actually is a guide to civilized urban living for a cultured man-about town. And it is fascinating precisely because it is so ordinary. It tells you how to furnish your house. It advises keeping a swing in the garden, and a lute hanging on the wall, and a place for the pet parrot. It lists the accomplishments a cultured person should acquire, and the list runs to 64 items, including singing, playing instruments, dancing, painting, flower arranging, cooking, gardening, teaching parrots to talk, solving riddles, composing poetry on the spot, carpentry, chemistry, and the art of applied magic. It discusses how to make friends, how to court, how to conduct a marriage, how to keep a household. It contains careful, humane advice about consent, and about paying attention to whether the other person is actually enjoying themselves, which was not a widespread concern in ancient literature. It exists because the civilization that produced it listed pleasure as one of the four legitimate aims of a human life, alongside duty, material success, and spiritual liberation. And having listed it, saw no reason not to write a proper technical manual about it, the way one would about statecraft or medicine or grammar. It is not transgressive. It is a reference book. The scandal is entirely a Victorian import, produced when the man who first translated it into English packaged it for a repressed audience and made a fortune. The real India of that period is the one in the book's margins. A man in a city with a garden and a swing and a parrot, he is teaching to talk, arranging flowers, worrying about whether he is any good at conversation. Here is one of the strangest facts in this whole story. Buddhism, which began in India, which grew there for 10 centuries, which produced Nalanda and Ashoka and some of the most sophisticated philosophy ever written, essentially died out in the land of its birth. And before it did, it conquered half of Asia. The roads Ashoka sent his monks down, kept working long after his empire fell. Monks and merchants moved together. The trade routes and the religion traveled the same paths, because merchants funded monasteries and monasteries gave merchants somewhere safe to stop. And so Buddhism went out along the arteries of trade in every direction. And everywhere it landed, it took root and became something local. It went south to Sri Lanka with Ashoka's own children, and from there through Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, and Laos, where it remains the faith of the overwhelming majority to this day, in a form that stayed close to the early teaching. It went north over the mountains and out along the Silk Road, through the oasis cities of Central Asia and into China, a journey of thousands of miles across the worst terrain on Earth, made by monks carrying manuscripts. It took centuries to sink in, and the Chinese initially found it deeply foreign, a religion of celibate beggars in a civilization built on family duty and ancestors. But it took, and it transformed, and it fused with Chinese thought to produce something new, a school focused on direct, sudden insight rather than scripture, which the Chinese called Chan. That went to Japan, where the name became Zen. It went from China to Korea, and from Korea to Japan. It went from India directly over the Himalaya into Tibet, where it merged with the local religion and grew into one of the most elaborate and philosophically rigorous traditions in the world, and where Nalanda's curriculum was transplanted almost wholesale. When Nalanda was destroyed, its lineages survived in Tibet, which is why Tibetan monasteries are, in a real sense, the continuation of a university in Bihar that burned 8 centuries ago. And the translation effort behind that spread is one of the great forgotten projects of human history. Thousands of texts, carried by hand across deserts and mountains, and then rendered into Chinese and Tibetan by teams working for centuries. One Chinese monk walked from China to India, spent 17 years there, studied at Nalanda, and walked back with hundreds of manuscripts and spent the rest of his life translating them. And his account of the journey is one of our best sources on India in that period, and it became the basis for one of the most beloved novels in Chinese literature. But in India itself, Buddhism faded, slowly over centuries, for reasons that are argued about and probably all partly true. Hinduism absorbed a great deal of it, and eventually simply declared the Buddha to be an avatar of Vishnu, which is a remarkably effective way of dissolving a rival. Buddhism's institutional life was concentrated in monasteries dependent on royal patronage, and when the patronage moved, the monasteries emptied, whereas Hinduism lived in every household and could not be defunded. And the invasions from the northwest, when they came, destroyed the great monastic centers, Nalanda among them, and Buddhism, unlike Hinduism, had no village-level base to fall back on. By 800 years ago, it was essentially gone from the land it was born in. There were, for centuries, almost no Buddhists in India. So the situation, for most of the last millennium, has been this: a religion founded by an Indian prince, elaborated by Indian philosophers, spread by an Indian emperor, taught at an Indian university, is practiced by hundreds of millions of people from Sri Lanka to Mongolia to Japan, and by almost no one where it started. And there is a small, strange coda. In 1956, an Indian lawyer named Ambedkar, who was born an untouchable, who fought his way through Columbia University and the London School of Economics, and who then wrote the Constitution of Independent India, publicly converted to Buddhism, along with several 100,000 of his followers, in a single ceremony, precisely because it was the Indian tradition that had never accepted caste. Millions have followed since. 25 centuries after the Buddha refused to ask anyone's caste before admitting them to his order, the people that Indian society had pushed furthest down came back and picked him up again on exactly that basis. The religion came home through the door it originally left open. We should stop before the ending and look at the half of this civilization that the texts mostly talk about rather than talk to, because the picture is genuinely complicated and it moved in the wrong direction over time. In the earliest layer, women appear with a freedom that later ages lost. There are hymns in the Rigveda composed by women, and their names are recorded. The Upanishads contain Gargi, who takes on the greatest philosopher of the age in open debate before a king and drives him to the edge of what he can answer, and Maitreyi, whose husband is about to renounce the world and divide his property, and who asks him whether wealth would make her immortal, and when he says no, says then what would I do with it, and asks him to teach her what he knows instead. These are not decorative figures. They are participants. The Buddha's order accepted nuns, after being talked into it, which is not to his credit, but he did it, and the poems those early nuns composed survive. They are called the verses of the elder nuns, and they are among the oldest known literature by women anywhere in the world, and some of them are startling. A woman celebrating her freedom from the kitchen and the pestle, a former courtesan on her lost beauty, a mother maddened by the death of her children being brought back from the edge, women writing 25 centuries ago about their own lives in their own voices. And then it narrowed. Over the following centuries, the law books tightened around women, restricting property, restricting education, lowering the age of marriage, formalizing the doctrine that a woman is under the protection of her father, then her husband, then her son, and never independent. Widow remarriage was progressively forbidden for the higher castes, and widows were reduced to a bleak, ritually degraded existence. Heads shaved, jewelry removed, treated as inauspicious. And in some communities, over time, there arose the practice of a widow burning herself on her husband's funeral pyre, which was never universal and was always a minority practice, but which existed and was celebrated in some quarters as the highest devotion, and which was not outlawed until the 1820s. And yet, simultaneously, in the same civilization, goddesses were worshipped as supreme and are still. Women ran the household religion, which is where most religion actually happened. Some ruled. There were queens who governed in their own right, including several in the south. The Tamil poetry has women poets whose work is unarguably first-rate, and the erotic literature and the sculpture treat female desire as real and worth attending to, which is more than most of the ancient world managed. So, a civilization that put women in its oldest scriptures as philosophers, and then spent a millennium writing rules to shut them in. Both are the same tradition. It is the same pattern we found with Rome and its slaves, and with India and its castes, not a contradiction to be resolved, just the ordinary shape of a very large and very old human thing, which contains its best and its worst simultaneously and has never been asked to choose. There is a picture of ancient India as a place of mystics, of holy men sitting in caves having visions. It is not wrong, exactly, but it misses the thing that actually characterized Indian intellectual life, which was arguing. Indian philosophy organized itself into schools, and those schools spent 20 centuries fighting each other in public, in formal debate, with rules. And the rules were serious. Before you were permitted to attack an opponent's position, you had to state it, accurately, in its strongest form, to the opponent's satisfaction. Only then could you refute it. Which means that Indian philosophical texts are structured as arguments in which the writer first makes his enemy's case as well as it can possibly be made, and then answers it. It is why we know what the schools that lost actually believed. Their opponents preserved their arguments, honestly, because the rules of the game required it. And what the schools believed is far stranger and more varied than the mystic picture suggests. There was a school of atomism, which held that the physical world is made of eternal, indivisible atoms of a few types, which combine into everything you can see. That is roughly the Greek atomist idea, arrived at independently and elaborated in far more detail. There was a school entirely devoted to logic and epistemology. How do we know anything? What counts as valid evidence? What makes an inference sound? They developed a formal theory of the syllogism, worked out the fallacies, and produced a technical vocabulary so precise that later Indian philosophy of every school had to argue in their terms. Buddhist logicians pushed it further still, and the whole thing reached a level of rigor that the West would arguably not match until the 19th century. There was a school built around sound and language and the interpretation of texts, which produced sophisticated theories of meaning and of how words connect to things. There was a dualist school that held that consciousness and matter are two separate eternal principles, and that liberation is the recognition that you are the former watching the latter. And out of that school's framework came classical yoga, with its 8 limbs and its precise account of what happens to a mind when you sit down and concentrate it. And there was the school that said all of it was nonsense. They were called the Charvaka or the Lokayata, the worldly ones, and they were, as far as anyone can tell, thoroughgoing materialists and atheists in the 6th century before our era. They held that only what you can perceive is real. There is no soul. There is no afterlife, no rebirth, no karma, no liberation, no gods. Consciousness is what matter does when it is arranged into a living body. And when the body stops, so does the person, permanently, completely, with nothing carrying on. The Vedas, they said, were the work of men, and the priests who performed the rituals were frauds running a business. If a sacrifice sends the animal to heaven, one text has them ask, why doesn't the worshipper sacrifice his own father? And their positive advice was simple. This is the only life you get, so live it. Eat well. Be happy. Borrow money if you have to. There is nothing after. Now, every single one of their own texts is lost. We have not one complete Charvaka work. Everything we know about them, we know because their opponents quoted them at length in order to refute them, following the rules of the argument culture. Their enemies preserved them. That is how we have their arguments at all. The people who hated them wrote their case down fairly, because that was how you were supposed to do it. And they were not some fringe curiosity. They are listed and dealt with seriously in the standard surveys of the schools for centuries. The Buddha argued against materialists. The epics contain them. A civilization that is usually presented as drowning in spirituality had, in fact, a well-known, long-running, articulate atheist tradition and treated it as one of the positions on the board. That is the thing to take from this. Ancient India held, simultaneously and for centuries, rigorous formal logic, atomic physics, absolute nonviolence, transcendent monism, elaborate polytheism, and confident atheism. all of them talking to each other in public under rules for 2 millennia. It was not a place with an opinion. It was a place having an argument. We have followed India's armies. Now follow something stranger. The places India conquered without ever sending one. Across Southeast Asia, Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, there sits a whole world built on Indian foundations, and India never ruled any of it. There was no conquest, no colonial administration, no garrisons. What there was merchants going east for gold and spices, and monks and Brahmins going with them, and local rulers looking at what they brought and deciding they wanted it. And what they wanted was the whole package. Indian scripts, so their languages could be written down for the first time. Indian religion, both Hindu and Buddhist. Indian ideas about kingship, which conveniently made a local chief into a god king. Indian epics, Indian law, Indian architecture. Sanskrit as a language of learning and prestige. They adopted it enthusiastically, adapted it completely, and made it theirs. The scripts of Thai, Burmese, Khmer, Lao, and Javanese all descend from Indian writing. Indonesian and Malay are full of Sanskrit words. Thai kings took the name Rama, and their capital's ceremonial name refers to the city of the god of the Ramayana. In Bali, a Hindu island in the largest Muslim country on earth, they still perform the Ramayana. And the greatest thing that came out of that transmission sits in the Cambodian jungle. Angkor Wat is the largest religious structure ever built by human beings. It was raised about 900 years ago by the Khmer Empire, and it was built as a Hindu temple dedicated to Vishnu, a Cambodian king building an Indian god's house on a scale India itself never matched. It is a model of the universe. The central quincunx of towers is the sacred mountain at the center of the world. The enclosure walls are the mountain ranges, and the moat, which is over 3 miles around and 600 feet wide, is the cosmic ocean. The whole thing is oriented so that at the spring equinox, the sun rises directly over the central tower. The galleries are lined with about half a mile of continuous bas-relief carving, including a vast panel showing the churning of the ocean of milk, a creation story from the Indian epics, executed in Cambodian stone by Khmer sculptors. And around it lay a city, the largest pre-industrial city on the planet by area. Aerial and radar surveys have revealed a sprawling low-density urban landscape covering hundreds of square miles, supported by an enormous engineered water system of reservoirs and canals designed to bank the monsoon and release it across the rice fields. Perhaps 750,000 people lived there, when London had maybe 18,000. And then, some centuries later, it broke, the water system apparently failing under a run of erratic monsoons and its own accumulated complexity, and the capital moving away. The jungle took the city back, but it never took the temple. Angkor Wat was never truly abandoned because Buddhist monks simply moved in and kept it running, and it has been in more or less continuous use for 900 years. It is on the Cambodian flag. So the largest religious building in the world is a Hindu temple in a Buddhist country, built by an empire that spoke neither Sanskrit nor any Indian language, using a cosmology and an architecture and a set of stories carried east by merchants who were only there for the pepper. That is India's real empire, not the one Chandragupta took with elephants, the one that arrived on trading ships, was invited in, and is still standing. The Gupta Golden Age ended the way these things usually do. Not from within, but from the northwest, which is where everything always came from. They were called the Hunas, a people related to, or at least part of the same great steppe disturbance as the Huns who were tearing Europe apart at exactly the same moment. And they came down through the passes in the 5th and 6th centuries and hit the Gupta Empire again and again. The Guptas beat them more than once, and one emperor smashed them decisively, and it cost so much in men and treasure that the empire never recovered its strength. The gold coinage debased. The provinces slipped away, and within a couple of generations, the Gupta Empire dissolved into successor states. There is a symmetry worth noticing here in the quiet. In the 5th century, on opposite ends of Eurasia, two of the great classical civilizations of the ancient world were both being ground down by horsemen out of the same steppe. Rome fell and did not get up. India came apart and simply carried on being India, because India had never been an empire that held it together in the first place. It was a civilization, with empires happening on top of it occasionally. Take the empire away, and the villages, the languages, the temples, the castes, the poems, the arguments were all still there. So the centuries after the Guptas are not a dark age. They are busy, prosperous, culturally rich, and politically fragmented. A shifting board of regional kingdoms, north and south, fighting each other and building temples and endowing universities and producing literature in a dozen languages. The greatest of the southern empires, the Cholas, are still centuries in the future at this point. The stone temples are mostly still to be built. The thing does not decline. It just stops being unified, which it had only briefly been anyway. And then, beginning in the 11th century, something came through those same northwestern passes that did not leave. The first phase was raiding, a Turkic ruler from Afghanistan who came down more than a dozen times over decades, not to rule but to strip. He hit the wealthy temples, because the temples were where the accumulated gold of centuries sat, and the most notorious raid destroyed a great temple on the western coast and carried its treasure away. These were plundering expeditions, and they were devastating, and they were also, crucially, temporary. He took the gold and went home. The second phase was conquest. At the end of the 12th century, another force came through, beat the northern kings, and this time stayed, and established a sultanate at Delhi that would rule much of northern India for 300 years, to be followed by the Mughals, who would rule more of it for 200 more and build the Taj Mahal. And that is, by most conventional reckonings, where ancient India ends and medieval India begins. It is also where the Buddhist monasteries were destroyed, Nalanda among them, and where Buddhism's institutional life in India was effectively finished. What followed over the next centuries was not the simple story of unrelieved catastrophe that gets told by some, nor the tidy story of harmonious synthesis told by others. It was both, in different places and different reigns, temples destroyed and temples patronized, brutal rulers and tolerant ones, conversion by pressure and conversion by choice, and vast numbers of people never converting at all. And it produced genuinely new things. A fusion architecture, new musical forms, new languages including the one that would become Hindi and Urdu, and devotional poet saints, Hindu and Muslim both, who spent their lives insisting that the whole quarrel was beside the point and that God did not care what you called him. This is contested ground in modern India, fiercely, and I am not going to litigate it tonight. I will just mark the boundary and stop, because the ancient world, the one we came here for, the one that runs from the Indus cities to the Guptas, closes here. But notice what did not happen, because it is the whole point of this story. Egypt ended. Its gods were forgotten. Its writing went silent for 20 centuries. Its language died on living tongues. And when we finally cracked the script, we were reading the words of strangers. Rome ended. Its empire dissolved. Its capital shrank to a village among ruins. And Europe spent a millennium living in the wreckage wondering who had built it. India did not end. Sultans and Mughals, and eventually the British ruled it. And underneath all of them, the thing kept running exactly as it had run under the Guptas and the Mauryas. The Vedas were still being recited, by memory, in the same meter. The epics were still being performed. The temples still had their morning rituals. Sanskrit was still being written. The dance still followed the rules laid down in the Natya Shastra. The villages still ran their own affairs and paid their grain to whoever was on top this century. Nobody had to decipher anything because nobody ever stopped speaking. There was no Rosetta Stone moment for the Vedas because there had never been a silence. When European scholars finally arrived and asked what these ancient texts said, there were people who could simply tell them because their families had been reciting them unbroken for 100 generations. That is what makes this the oldest living civilization. Not that it is the oldest. Egypt and Sumer are older. That it is still going. And yet, and this is the strange twist, India did forget things. Enormous things. Not its living traditions, which never broke, but its own history. Because India, for all its literature, never much went in for writing history. There is no Indian Herodotus, no Thucydides, no Livy. There are dynastic lists in the mythological texts, mixed in with gods and impossible reign lengths. There are inscriptions. There is one genuine historical chronicle from Kashmir. But the systematic, dated, critical narrative of what happened and when, which the Greeks and Chinese and Romans produced obsessively, India, on the whole, did not write. A civilization that thought in billion-year cycles was not much impressed by the question of which king reigned in which decade. So the living tradition rolled on, and the actual past dropped out from under it. By 200 years ago, nobody in India, or anywhere else, knew that the Indus civilization had ever existed. Nobody knew who Ashoka was, beyond a name in some Buddhist legends. Nobody could read the ancient script on the pillars scattered across the country. The caves at Ajanta had been swallowed by jungle for 1,200 years. The great stupa at Sanchai was overgrown. The Buddha was so thoroughly gone from Indian memory that European scholars initially could not work out whether he had been a real person, a Sun myth, or an African. The past was simply lying there, in plain sight, 30 feet tall, polished, standing in fields, and it was mute. The person who broke it open was a young Englishman named James Prinsep, who worked at the Mint in Calcutta, and who was, by any measure, brilliant. The problem was the same one that stops us with the Indus script. An unknown writing system, no bilingual key. Ancient Brahmi, the script on Ashoka's pillars and rocks, had been unreadable for over 10 centuries. People had been trying for decades. Prinsep collected every inscription he could get copies of, from all over the subcontinent, and worked on them for years, publishing his failures openly so others could build on them. The break came from short, repetitive inscriptions on the railings at Sanchai. He noticed that a great many of them were only 2 words long and ended in the same 2 characters. And he made a guess. These are donation records. Somebody's name, and then the word meaning gift of. 2 characters, 1 word, thousands of examples. That was the wedge. From those 2 characters, in 1837, the whole script came apart in his hands. And when it did, the pillars spoke. The rocks spoke, and out of them came a voice nobody had ever heard. A king calling himself beloved of the gods, who spoke of remorse and compassion and tolerance and medical care for animals. And nobody had the faintest idea who he was, because he used a title, not a name. It took further work, and a copy of the edicts found later that included the personal name, before the identification was locked down. This was Ashoka, the emperor from the Buddhist legends, who turned out to have been entirely real and considerably more extraordinary than the legends made him. An emperor was recovered from oblivion in the 1830s by a mint official reading donation records off a fence. Prinsep worked himself to death doing it. He collapsed and died at 40, and there is a memorial to him on the riverbank in Kolkata. And once the script cracked, the whole ancient past came flooding back within a century. The edicts were read and mapped, and Ashoka's empire was reconstructed from them. The lost caves at Ajanta had been found by a tiger hunting party a few years earlier, and now they could be dated. The Buddhist sites named in the Chinese pilgrims' travel accounts were located, one, by matching the Chinese descriptions to the ground, including the actual tree the Buddha sat under and the deer park where he first taught. Nalanda was excavated, and in the 1920s, the archaeologists finally dug at Harappa and Mohenjo-daro and pushed Indian history back 2 millennia overnight. There is a lovely accident in it. Much of what we know about ancient India comes from foreigners who wrote things down because Indians didn't bother. A Greek ambassador at the Mauryan court, Chinese monks keeping careful travel diaries, a Persian scholar who came with a raiding army in the 11th century and stayed to learn Sanskrit and write the most honest and admiring account of India any outsider produced for 10 centuries. A civilization that declined to record its own history was recorded in fragments by visitors, and then reassembled 20 centuries later from their notes and its own silent stones. So what did it leave? This civilization that never had an ending. Start with the one you cannot get away from. Every number written anywhere on Earth today, every price, every measurement, every equation, every line of code, every calculation any machine has ever performed, runs on a system worked out in ancient India. The digits, the place value, and the zero. If you had to name the single most consequential technology ever handed from one civilization to the rest of the species, it would be difficult to beat that. It is so completely absorbed that nobody thinks of it as coming from anywhere. It is just how numbers work. Then the religions. Something like 1.5 billion people follow traditions born in this land. Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, and Buddhism in particular went out and became the faith of half of Asia while quietly dying at home. Ideas that were worked out by people sitting under trees on the Ganges plain 25 centuries ago now shape the inner lives of a fifth of humanity, from Colombo to Kyoto. Then the vocabulary of the inner life. Karma, Dharma, Nirvana, Guru, Yoga, Avatar, which now means the little picture representing you online, a word for a god taking a body, put to work by an industry that has no idea what it is saying. Mantra, Pundit. These are Sanskrit words that English simply took, because English had no word for the thing. Then the practices. Yoga is a global industry. Meditation, which India developed as a serious instrument for investigating the mind, has been handed back by Western neuroscience as a validated clinical intervention, which is a little like returning someone's telescope and telling them it turns out you can see things with it. Then the ordinary things. Chess, cotton, sugar, and the word for it. Pepper, which the Romans bankrupted themselves for. Snakes and ladders. Plastic surgery, still called the Indian flap. Cataract surgery. Inoculation. Steel that made the legendary blades of the Middle East. The buttons on your shirt, probably from the Indus cities. And then the thing that is hardest to point at, but might be the biggest. Non-violence as a political method. Ahimsa came out of the Jain and Buddhist traditions 25 centuries ago, and it sat there as a religious discipline for most of history. And then a lawyer picked it up in the 20th century and used it to remove the largest empire on earth from his country without an army. And a minister in Alabama watched that and used it again. And it became one of the few genuinely new political technologies of the modern age. A rule about not stepping on insects turned into a method for dismantling empires. And it left a way of thinking that is worth sitting with. This is the civilization that concluded that the argument matters more than the answer, that stated its opponents' positions honestly before refuting them, that preserved its own atheists' writings by quoting them, that produced monism and polytheism and materialism and logic and mysticism simultaneously, and did not feel any urgent need to pick. It never had one book, one prophet, one authority, one council to decide what was true. It had a conversation, and the conversation has been going for 3 millennia and has never been closed. That, more than the zero or the temples or the bronzes, may be the real inheritance, not a doctrine, a tolerance for the size of the question. There is a moment I want to leave you with before the dark. Somewhere in India, tomorrow morning, before the sun is properly up, a man will stand in a river and recite verses that were composed more than 3,000 years ago, before the Trojan War, before Rome, before the Buddha, before writing existed in that part of the world at all. He will get them right, every syllable in the right pitch, in the right meter, because his teacher got them right, and his teacher's teacher, back and back through 100 generations, unbroken by voice alone. He will not be doing it for a museum. He will be doing it because it is morning. That is the thing about this story. Everywhere else we have gone together. We have gone as archaeologists. We stood in Egypt among tombs, and every person in that story was 3 millennia dead, and their gods forgotten, and their language silent. We walked through Rome, and watched the whole thing fall down, and Europe live in its ruins for 10 centuries, unable to make the concrete. Here the thing never stopped. The river is the same river. The verses are the same verses. The dance still follows the rules laid down when Rome was standing. The temple's still open in the morning, and the god is still bathed and dressed. Nothing had to be recovered, because nothing was ever quite lost. Egypt is a wonder. Rome is a warning. India is a survivor, the only one of the great ancient civilizations that is still 5,000 years on, simply going about its business. So let it all grow quiet now, and settle, and drift away into the dark. The wind coming off the ocean, with the year's rain in it. The cities on the Indus, with their straight streets and their covered drains and their unreadable seals, packing up and walking away because the rain changed. The singers memorizing the hymns backwards so that no syllable could ever slip. The forest thinkers asking what a person is underneath, and a father dissolving salt in water to show his son. A prince walking out of a palace at night, past his sleeping wife, to go and find out why everything hurts, and sitting down under a tree and not getting up until he had it. Alexander's men, standing in the rain at the river, refusing to go further. A boy from nowhere taking an empire and giving it away and starving himself to death on a hill. His grandson walking the field at Kalinga and carving his remorse into rock where it stood in the open for 20 centuries with nobody able to read it. The surgeon making a man a new nose out of his own forehead. The mathematicians looking at nothing and giving it a name. Panini building a language into an algorithm so it could live in a head. The painters working by reflected light in the dark of the caves, and the caves going quiet, and the jungle coming over the door. The dancing god inside his ring of fire, one hand raised, saying, "Do not be afraid." And a young Englishman at a mint, 20 centuries later, reading the word gift off a fence, and an emperor beginning to speak. Let all of it grow soft and far away now. You don't have to hold any of it. It has been holding itself, without any help from us, for 5,000 years, and it will still be there in the morning. The river, the verses, the lamps in the doorways, the whole enormous unbroken conversation, going on quietly in the dark without needing anything at all from you tonight. So let it blur and fade and sink down out of the whole long stream of it into the still deep quiet underneath, where there are no empires and no questions and nothing to work out, where you are not a person with a day tomorrow, just the thing underneath that resting. Rest now. The oldest living civilization on Earth has been keeping its watch for 5,000 years, and it does not need you to stay awake for it. Let it go and sleep. And when the dark comes down again, I'll be here to carry you off to another time long ago, while the wonder of it still stands. Sleep well.